Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this Resolution Foundation conference. Now, my name's Torsten Bell. I'm the Chief Exec of the Foundation, and we spend a lot of our lives travelling around the country to all the nations and the regions, and we work on all things economic policy, because those are the things that shape living standards, and that's what our charity exists to spend its time on. But there isn't, although today may be something of an exception, there isn't enough national, in the UK sense, discussion of the lessons we can learn from right around the United Kingdom, from each of the different nations. And that is a big missed opportunity, partly because there are big policy interactions, and you'll be staggered by how often people don't know what is happening in other parts of the United Kingdom that directly affect the decisions they are taking. But in a rather more worthy sense, and from those of us from an academic background, it's a missed opportunity to learn from each other, because lots of people are working on the same policy areas, they're taking different policy initiatives, and they're learning about what worked, and I'm afraid often what didn't work. And ideally, those things would be known and understood. So today we're hosting a conference jointly with ourselves and PolicyWise. For those of you who don't know, PolicyWise, the Open University encourages comparative research and knowledge exchange right the way across the UK and Ireland. So all the things I just said we need more of, that is them. If you're not following them, you should be. And we think this is exactly the right time to be discussing it, because it's the 25th anniversary of probably the biggest constitutional change in most living memory outside of Brexit. We can come back to that later, I'm sure, later, but it's certainly the biggest constitutional change within the United Kingdom during my lifetime. And that duration is important. There's not a lot of point holding this conference 5 years into devolution, partly because the policy differences have grown, and in one way that is how the opportunity for learning comes. And over the longer the devolution experience has gone on, you see distinct policy and political cultures also emerging. So you just see there's more difference to be learned from, but also because the devolution settlement, as again we're going to come back to in a second, has evolved. It's now a far more comprehensive economic settlement than it was back in 1999, when we were very, very focused on public services and those parts of the state that were already run independently, but maybe not with democratic oversight. And 25 years means that we've had long enough for politicians to make their entire careers in a devolution era, which means that we have elder statesmen, not in the pejorative sense, before anyone gets offended, but in the sense of experienced statesmen and women who have lived in that environment and can tell us about it and have learned from the experiences of doing so. So the agenda for today, up on the screen here, means that because of that, 25 years has passed, we're going to be able to start and finish today's conference with two of the towering figures of that devolution era. So in a second, we're going to start with John Swinney, former Deputy First Minister of Scotland, who has lived and breathed every aspect of that over the 25 years. And then finishing us off this afternoon is going to be Mark Drakeford, until very recently the First Minister of Wales. Both, as I say, have the lived experience of economic and lots of other policy areas making over that period. And then in between, we're going to have two great panels. So you're going to first of all hear about the experience of tax and welfare policy making, people making different choices, experimentation, and what we've learned from those. And then in the second panel session, we're going to focus beyond some of those micro decisions onto some of the bigger picture questions of economic strategy, growth and spending, different approaches to economic policy making. Now, obviously, there'll be something of an artificial split between those two panels. I don't believe anyone has got enough discipline not to mention tax changes in the second one, and vice versa, but you can't have it all in life. So we've got brilliant speakers. What do you need to deal with brilliant speakers? Because otherwise they go on too long. You need a brilliant chair. So luckily you have one. So for those panels, Claudia Rice, business correspondent for BBC Northern Ireland. Thank you very much indeed, Claudia, for coming this morning. She's also fresh from the Northern Ireland budget last week. And then all of you, both online and in the room, can ask questions on Slido. It's hashtag economic lessons. As I said to the team, that is the worthiest hashtag of all time. If you're in the room, you can also ask questions using your hand and mouth. We'd encourage that in the right way. Hand up, then you ask the question with your mouth, yeah? Right, but to kick us off, we're going to start with John Swinney, who has seen it all. He's an MSP since 1999, although he's told me this morning he thinks there's 10 left from 99, which is more than I thought. So he's held almost every senior cabinet role under Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, and he was Deputy First Minister between 2014 and 2023. It's all gone downhill since then, but he's going to be too polite to say that. So, no one better to kick us off. Over to you, John. Ooh, squeeze on.
thank you very much, Torsten, and I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity provided by the Resolution Foundation to reflect on 25 years of devolution. As Torsten said, I have lived and breathed every bit of it, because not only have I been a member of the Scottish Parliament since its inception in 1999, I think I am the only remaining serving Member of Parliament in Scotland who voted for the Scotland Act in 1998 when it passed the House of Commons, having been elected in the 1997 general election, but made my choice to serve in the Scottish Parliament consistently thereafter. So this is a really welcome opportunity to reflect on what's frankly been the dominant period of my professional life, and a great privilege to do so. So thank you very much, Torsten, for the invitation, and to the Resolution Foundation for providing the opportunity to reflect on what's been a really important journey, and I think there's lots of lessons to draw from that. On a flagstone in the Scottish Parliament building, there's an etching of some words from one of the strongest advocates of Scottish devolution, the late John P. Mackintosh, who was the Labour MP for East Lothian until his untimely death in 1978. The etching reads, "People in Scotland want a degree of government for themselves. It is not beyond the wit of man to devise the institutions to meet these demands." Now, although an advocate and proponent of Scottish independence throughout my adult life, I accept that the aspiration set out by John P. Mackintosh was, for the majority of people at that time, largely fulfilled when the structures that were designed in the Scotland Act 1998 were introduced. Those views have not, however, proven static. People in Scotland have not remained in the same position on the constitutional question they were in 1999. In the intervening years, political debate and sentiment have continued to wrestle with actually addressing the challenges laid down by John P. Mackintosh, which was to design the structures and powers that best reflect the aspirations of people in Scotland. In general, the majority position over that period has been that people in Scotland wanted to have more powers than were devolved in 1999 to effect change. Further powers have been devolved in roughly 3 tranches that have, to a greater or lesser degree, better met the aspirations of people in Scotland, but not yet in their entirety. The original devolution proposition that came into effect in 1999, I believe, was a genuine attempt to address the democratic deficit in Scotland. It was designed to put the responsibilities that had been exercised in the pre-devolution era within administratively devolved structures of the Secretary of State for Scotland under effective democratic control. No longer would people in Scotland have policies pursued that had been put in place by governments that did not command a legitimate mandate from the people of Scotland. So the original devolution settlement gave the Scottish Parliament no more powers and no greater budget than had existed under administrative devolution, with the exception of the rather blunt taxation mechanism of varying the basic rate of income tax by 3p in the pound. But it did democratise the handling of these powers, and I'll come later to the innovation that that process enabled. Those original powers remained largely unaltered until the Scotland Act 2012, with the exception of powers on control of the rail industry that were devolved under the Railways Act 2005, which enabled Scottish ministers to determine railway policy in Scotland, including management of the ScotRail franchise, infrastructure and fare levels. These powers over the rail network have been used effectively to expand the scope of the rail network, with 6 new rail projects opening since the powers were devolved, providing greater opportunities for modal shift, and also to bring the network into public ownership where it now sits. The second tranche of powers came in the Scotland Act 2012 that brought forward legislation arising from the Calman Commission, which was established by the Unionist parties in the Scottish Parliament as an alternative forum to the constitutional agenda of the minority SNP government of the time. It produced powers to set rates of income tax in Scotland, to design landfill and stamp duty taxes, to enable very limited borrowing, and provide some further powers over drink driving and firearms, which were public issues of debate at the time. The Scottish Government moved quickly to establish replacement taxes for landfill tax and stamp duty, with the introduction of land and buildings transaction tax being undertaken in a way to reduce the burden on lower priced properties to assist a policy objective of assisting those on low incomes. The income tax powers, however, remained too blunt to be deployed, with the requirement to vary each income tax rate by the same margin, meaning that they did not give the opportunity to reduce the tax burden for lower earners without providing a greater benefit for higher earners. As a result, I was not willing to deploy those powers. The limitation on the use of the powers therefore impeded the adoption of a policy that would have been within the prevailing policy ambition of the Scottish Government. The opportunity to pursue tax and social security policies that were more suitable to Scotland came with a third tranche of powers, devolved in the Scotland Act 2016, which emerged from the Smith Commission proposals. In the aftermath of the independence referendum, the UK Prime Minister established the Smith Commission, including representatives of all 5 Scottish parliamentary parties of the time. I was one of its members. The Commission recommended a range of powers be devolved, including the power to set income tax rates and bands in Scotland, although not the personal allowance, to have greater but still limited borrowing abilities, responsibility for air passenger duty, and powers to set and administer a number of benefits, including disability living allowance, the personal independence payment, the winter fuel payment, the creation of new benefits, powers to alter the bedroom tax, and to have greater control over the Crown estate. It also recommended that a share of VAT be allocated to Scotland as part of the annual financial settlement, largely so that the UK parties could claim that 50% of Scotland's budget was devolved, but proposed no powers to change VAT levels. The Scotland Act 2016 finally enabled a great deal more variance to be established in policy making through the use of some tax and welfare levers that had previously not been available. In using these powers since 2016, the Scottish Government has created a distinct tax policy, with measures being taken that have required people on higher incomes to pay more in taxation than if they lived in the rest of the United Kingdom. The fiscal impact of such measures is assessed by the Scottish Fiscal Commission, a body independent of the Scottish Government, and the conclusions of that analysis are shared with Parliament as ministers set out their budget proposals. The utilisation of these powers now generates over £1 billion in public expenditure that would not have been available had these powers not been used. This has expanded the resources available to the Scottish Parliament. The devolution of a range of welfare powers has seen some benefits devolve for delivery in Scotland, and the opportunity created to develop new benefits. The principal, and I would contend most impactful, has been the creation of the Scottish Child Payment. The first Scottish Child Payments began in February 2021 at the rate of £10 a week for each child under 6, where the parent is eligible for a qualifying benefit, such as universal credit. Doubling of the payment to £20 a week per child was rolled out from April 2022. In advance of the expected extension of the eligibility to under 16s, a system of bridging payments was put in place for children between 6 and 16, in effect advancing a formal rollout, and the payment increased to £25 a week per child, and eligibility was formally extended to under 16s in November 2022. The purpose of the payment is to make a direct impact on family income to address child poverty. To assess the difference this makes, a family with 3 children will receive an additional £3,900 a year, a significant addition to a low-income household. It is a regular payment, and modelling puts the impact on child poverty rates at a reduction of approximately 5%. The latest statistics show payments are being made in respect of just over 316,000 children, and Scotland now has a relative child poverty rate of 24% compared to a UK level of 30%. Professor Danny Dorling recently described the Scottish Child Payment as the single policy intervention that has created the largest fall in child poverty anywhere in Europe for at least 40 years. The Scottish Child Payment represents a formidable intervention using devolved powers to deliver a different policy outcome in the wake of prevailing UK policies. The other area of interest in this discussion is on policy differentiation in relation to economic policy. One of the concerns I had during the Smith Commission was that the package proposed was imbalanced. Scope was created to develop new approaches on welfare, but there were insufficient powers to boost the size and the direction of the economy, a critical requirement if different social policy paths are to be paid for. Despite the expansion of the powers of the Parliament, the scope for significant divergence in approaches to the management of the economy and the creation of new economic opportunities remain limited to the powers that were available at the onset of devolution. A range of interventions have been taken by successive Scottish governments to stimulate economic growth. The first approach, going back to the early devolved governments, has been to establish and expand a network of international offices to promote Scottish economic opportunities in a number of critical markets around the globe. This has provided a valuable platform and connection point for Scottish companies overseas, and a sustained base for Scottish Development International to bring together all relevant interested parties to maximise the business and trading opportunities for Scotland overseas. This has been a critical platform for the Scotch whisky industry, energy interests and life science organisations. Now, there's been a great amount actually, in my personal experience, of practical cooperation with UK embassies across the globe. But there is now, unfortunately, an increasing amount of political noise from the UK government about how these arrangements work, and I regret that. The second area has been to maintain a network of economic agencies across Scotland dedicated to supporting the company base to expand. These organisations, Scottish Enterprise, Highlands Anne's Enterprise and the South of Scotland Enterprise, have been key players in enabling strategic economic developments to happen. Two of the finest examples I would cite are the approach of Scottish Enterprise in leading a consortium of universities, health boards, local authorities to create the Edinburgh Bioquarter, which has created a phenomenal life sciences cluster around the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh. And the other is the establishment by Highlands Anne's Enterprise of the Beechwood campus in Inverness, which has been a driving force of the development of the Highland capital, the significant expansion of the Highland capital, with the attraction of major organisations and educational institutions to be based in that area, fueling the process of economic growth in the north of Scotland. The critical role of the agencies in drawing all of this together cannot be understated. I watched in utter bemusement as the United Kingdom government dismantled regional economic structures after 2010 and experienced an inevitable loss of impetus in economic development as a consequence. The third area is in skills development and alignment between educational institutions and business activity. The development of the foundation, modern and graduate apprenticeship programmes, the focus on ensuring young people leave school for positive destinations and broadening access to higher and further education have all combined to deliver higher levels of engagement in the workforce in Scotland. The fourth area is in efforts to reduce direct costs for business. Probably the key example of this is the Small Business Bonus Scheme, introduced by the SNP government in 2007, which removes approximately 100,000 small businesses from the payment of business rates. This measure has been designed to support local economies and sustain businesses in communities. The fifth area has been the design of infrastructure to support innovation and to address the need to improve the level of business startups in Scotland. It's commonly referred to as the innovation ecosystem. This has been, the issue of business startup has been a historic problem within Scotland, but the focus of this work has successfully increased the level of business startup in Scotland, and the innovation ecosystem is now focusing on the question of scale-up with the introduction by the government of a number of tech scalers which are designed to fuel that process around the country. And finally, the enhancement of the physical infrastructure of Scotland through the sustained capital investment programme. This has included the construction of the new Queensferry crossing, the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route, the completion of the Central Scotland motorway network, the significant electrification of the rail network, the opening of 6 new rail routes, including a railway to the Scottish borders, and the establishment of hundreds of early learning and childcare centres around the country to deliver expanded early years provision, which is often seen as a social intervention, but for me, in authorising that work, it was motivated as an economic intervention to enable greater participation in the labour market. These 6 themes illustrate the approaches that have been taken to assist economic development, but it should be stressed that all of these actions were possible within the original powers set for the Parliament in 1999. Meeting the demand for the Parliament to be able to intervene in economic activity to a greater extent would undoubtedly require further powers to be awarded, and I believe that is a valid and important part of the debate about the appropriate powers for the Parliament. In considering the events of the last 25 years, it is important to reflect that devolution was designed to address the democratic deficit in Scotland, not initially at least a deficit of powers, but the democratic responsibility has enabled policy interventions that has led to different approaches being taken in different parts of the United Kingdom. That is an inherent characteristic of any devolved structure of governance. Why would a political system establish devolved structures without accepting there will be differences in the approaches to be taken, and therefore an inevitable, and I would say welcome, level of innovation? Amongst the legislative measures that have been taken forward by the Scottish Parliament have been measures that the Westminster Parliament just simply never had the time or the space to get round to addressing. One of the first acts passed by the Scottish Parliament was an example of this type of issue, the abolition of Feudal Tenure Scotland Act 2000. This significant reform of our system of land ownership was followed in 2003 by the Land Reform Scotland Act, which enshrined in law the right of responsible access in Scotland. These were 2 major policy measures that emerged because the Scottish Parliament was able to address long-running issues that had never been prioritised. Hence, the democratic aspirations of people in Scotland were addressed as a consequence. There have also been substantial legislative instruments to address problems deeply ingrained in Scottish society on major public health issues. The Smoking, Health and Social Care Scotland Act 2005 banned smoking in public places, leading the way within the United Kingdom. Without the power to tax alcohol, the Scottish Parliament legislated for the provision of minimum unit pricing of alcohol through the Alcohol Minimum Pricing Scotland Act 2012. These were policy innovations that have demonstrated the benefit of taking different initiatives in different parts of the United Kingdom. Major reforms have been legislated for to improve the well-being of individuals through the Community Care and Health Scotland Act 2002, which introduced free personal care, and the Public Bodies Joint Working Scotland Act 2014, a rather mechanistic title, but the Act provided for the integration of health and social care services at local level, which enabled the creation of a more cohesive set of services to meet the demands of vulnerable individuals in society. Aside from legislation, devolution enabled the government in Scotland to pursue policy initiatives that were, at first sight, excluded from the areas of responsibility of the Scottish Parliament. Policy initiatives such as the establishment of the Fresh Talent Scheme in 2004, which enabled international students to stay longer in Scotland to help boost population growth, or the introduction of the Malawi International Development Programme, which enabled Scotland to support development in Malawi. These were both initiatives undertaken in expressly reserved areas, but enabled by agreement with the Home Office and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, respectively. We live now, however, in changed days. It is inconceivable that the current, rather aggressive United Kingdom government would countenance any encroachment by the Scottish Parliament or the Scottish Government on currently reserved areas, certainly not on an issue of migration and population growth. The prevailing political culture has, not surprisingly, had a significant impact on the nature of policy making within the Scottish Parliament. That political culture has been shaped by 2 factors: the structure of government that has been in place at any given time, minority, majority, coalition, all sorts of shapes and forms, and also by the condition of the constitutional argument on independence. In general, up to 2014, I think it's fair to say there was a prevailing political culture across all parties that was keen to get things done, to try to find ways of creating agreement, to make use of the powers of devolution to improve the lives of people in Scotland. I think it's also fair to say that the prevailing political culture today makes it more difficult to get things done than at any previous point in the devolution experience. In the last 25 years, there have been multiple examples of the use of the powers of the Scottish Parliament with significant effect in Scotland. As the powers of the Parliament have expanded over this period, so has the impact of the Parliament, especially in areas of taxation and welfare. The dynamics of the work of the Parliament do not take their course in isolation. They are significantly affected by the prevailing political and economic context in the United Kingdom. That context has changed over time. During the period of the Labour government until 2010, there was a prevailing political and economic direction in the United Kingdom that the Scottish Parliament and government, whether Labour or SNP-led, was able to complement. That resulted in significant progress in the erosion of poverty levels in Scotland due to the combined efforts of the UK and Scottish governments. Since 2010, that prevailing direction has changed, and the Scottish Government has had to act to achieve its policy objectives, especially in tackling poverty, in the face of that challenging and different prevailing political direction. That results in some of the additionality that should come from measures like the Scottish Child Payment being lost, while steps have to be taken to mitigate UK measures like the benefit cap. At present, the Scottish Government is wrestling, and not for the first time, with the impact of a decision to cut capital spending at UK level. And that has an effect on the finances available to Scotland to invest in our own infrastructure, including the important transition to net zero. For the last few years, this unhelpful policy direction has been added to by a hostile outlook from the UK government towards devolution, formed by the UK government's response to Brexit. Before the Brexit process, the UK government had never legislated in devolved areas without consent from the Scottish Parliament. It has now done so on 11 occasions. For most of the devolution years, the UK government has been a rather benign presence in the operation of the devolved structures. That is different now, and should future UK governments take the same attitude, it would pose a real threat to the prospects and the effectiveness of devolution. A key element of the devolution journey has been the relationship between the devolved governments of the United Kingdom. In my experience, despite political leadership that has stretched right across the political spectrum, all three devolved governments worked well together, and often in concert with issues that everybody shared in advancing our respective policy objectives with the United Kingdom government. In general, we tended to share the same perspective in advancing our issues in relation to the UK government. Let me conclude with some final observations on what this journey of devolution has achieved for people in Scotland. In short, and without rose-tinted spectacles, I believe devolution has improved the governance of Scotland. The work of the Scottish Parliament, its committees and its structure of scrutiny has delivered greater and more effective democratic accountability in Scotland. Governments that have included members of 4 political parties, Labour, Liberal Democrat, SNP and Green, have delivered bold social and economic policies. Yes, there have been constraints, and yes, there have been failings. But there has often also been a willingness to stretch the boundaries of devolution to find solutions that address fundamental challenges facing the people of Scotland on public health, welfare and migration. That would not have been possible without devolution, and Scotland is the better for it. In looking to the future, I am of course an independence supporter, but I also care about the progress of devolution. I'm concerned that the ability of our current devolved powers to meet the aspirations of the people in the current constitutional setup is being eroded. We are not currently meeting the test set by John P. Mackintosh. Over the last few years, the UK government has disrespected devolution and used Brexit as an excuse to structurally and legislatively constrain the scope for action of the devolved institutions. A change of UK government provides the opportunity to re-establish the purpose of devolution and to equip the Scottish Parliament with the economic powers that would enable it to operate in a much more cohesive and emphatic way in its policy interventions. The period ahead will tell whether that prospect will be delivered. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, John. We covered a lot of ground there that we're going to try to dig into, covering powers, political culture, policy decisions, and outcomes. There's loads of great questions on Slido already, but it's a reminder that you can put more on there on #economic-lessons, or you can put your hand up in the room. I thought one of the great things about your reflections, as I said at the beginning, benefiting from you having been there pre-1999, as you reminded us, is to take that historical sweep. And I think some of the democratic arguments for where we ended up in 99 maybe get lost in the technocratic day-to-day of getting through lots of decisions. So let's start by taking you back to 1999 on two questions. So the first would, how successful did you expect devolution to be compared to what's actually then happened?
I thought devolution would make a profound impact because of the ability to address those significant questions that Westminster, and this is no criticism of Westminster, there's loads of issues got to be wrestled with in the United Kingdom Parliament, just never got round to doing. So land reform was an issue that people were really concerned about in Scotland, and it just would never have made it up the agenda in Westminster, but the Scottish Parliament could address that. I think it's important to remember that in actually the early days of devolution, the Parliament became really quite unpopular. A bit of that was driven, I think, by two things. One was the building project went completely off the rails and cost a lot more than was anticipated.
To remind everyone which building project we mean.
The Parliament building project, it was estimated in the white paper to cost 40 million. It cost 440 million pounds, so it was kind of...
It was suboptimal.
It was, but the building's lovely, but it was much more
the building's
expensive.
The building's not suboptimal, the cost was.
The costing was. Yeah. And then the second thing was that I think people probably expected the world to change like that in 1999, and it didn't. So I hope what I've set out today says that over a quarter of a century, I think Scotland's a very, very different place with a very different legislative structure and footprint. So yes, I think it has been profound change, but go back to, if you looked at a poll in 2001, and people were really half-hearted about the Parliament, what's this done for us? But I think when you look back over, but it's exactly your point in the introduction, look back over that period of years and you can see there's a profound impact.
Great. That actually generally is a thing we see, which is when you ask people, would you like some more politicians? They're often not massively enthusiastic. I know you all are, obviously, but they're not. But the lived experience, we see it in Manchester now. Once you've got a because of the democratic benefit for having a visibility, the accountability, people do tend to be perkier afterwards than at the time.
And the other thing is that very, very quickly the Scottish Parliament became the focal point of Scottish political debate. So it shifted dramatically.
Do you think that was actually a shock to some of the people that were pro-devolution? The degree to which, because I completely agree.
Yes, I think people were a bit taken aback by the extent to which it all really came into
like those MPs that didn't follow you.
Yeah, and there was that change of focus. I think left Scottish MPs at Westminster a bit wondering what their role in life was.
I mean, we've all got that angst, but yes, I agree. That was definitely around all through the 2000s. Right, last thing on the question on the looking back to 25 years. So one of the big themes of your remarks is the evolution of devolution. Right? It's changed very significantly, particularly in the economic sphere. Did you think it would change? It would evolve that much?
I suppose it's best to say that I was optimistic it would. I couldn't have been certain about it, but I felt that as the Parliament, it was interesting listening to debate in Parliament, and I don't just include my perspective, and my cards are on the table. I'm an independent supporter. I want the Parliament to be able to do everything. But it was interesting listening to my colleagues who come from unionist parties. They also wanted the Parliament to do more. So it wasn't something that was just contained in our group. Others wanted the Parliament to be more impactful, to be able to do bolder things, to take bigger initiatives. So there was actually quite a bit of pushing to do
the direction
more.
Of travel.
And if you take that example, the Fresh Talent Initiative in 2004, which was about migration, that was advanced by the former First Minister Jack McConnell, Labour First Minister. He sought my support as leader of the SNP at that time for this, that we would support him, and we did. And he successfully negotiated with the Home Office, and it was a good thing.
Very good. Right, let's take some of the questions that people are asking online. The most popular one is probably not a surprise. No, we're coming to that one later. Is on what else? So if you're allowed one other power, what's the biggest ask for the next evolution of powers?
I think the area that's got to be explored are the powers to create significantly more economic opportunity. And I think those relate to areas around about employment policy, around business policy, and around population policy, because we all know that population growth is a significant driver of economic growth. We face a challenge. If you go back again over the 25 years, Scotland was facing an acute challenge about the size of its working age population in the early part of the 21st century, with great alarm being expressed and great leadership being given by the Labour executive of the time about this question, which is where the Fresh Talent Initiative came from. Now, these concerns were largely addressed by EU expansion in 2004 and the migration that followed from that. So our working age population grew, and it's not been, certainly nothing like the critical factor it was in 2000. It's now a critical factor post-Brexit because of the challenges about migration. So I think that's the scope, and my concern during the Smith Commission was that the additional powers were welcome. How on earth could I stand in the way of more powers coming to Scottish Parliament, Scottish Nationalist? But I was concerned about the balance of those powers not giving sufficient opportunity to build and support economic growth.
So since you've raised that, was the one thing you find, you spent a lot of time around in Holyrood, a lot of people who were, let's say, less optimistic or positive than you were about devolution, one of the things that made them in the end come round to more devolution of tax-raising powers, far more, it's a radically transformed settlement from 1999, was that they thought more tax devolution would help shift discussion in Holyrood towards growth issues, and so more on how to grow the pie and a bit less on the distribution of the pie. I think you'd probably say that hasn't happened hugely, but maybe I'm being unfair. What do you think?
I think that's probably fair. That I don't think the Parliament is as focused on how it can grow the resources that are available to it than it could be. And I think that's a product of the limitations on the scope of the Parliament being able to act in that direction.
Okay, so you think so it's like internal markets.
So what I was trying to say in my speech is that I think the Parliament has stretched the boundaries, it's tried to push the boat out to do more, but the limitation is that it's tried to do that within the existing arrangements, and I'm very open to what more can the Parliament do within its powers to encourage greater growth and dynamism. But the issue you will often rub up against is that there are limitations on the powers to make that difference.
Definitely. Let's move on to. So you talk quite a bit about how the political culture has changed over those 25 years in phases. So there's one thing on the political culture, then I want to come to the policy-making culture, which is probably not talked about much in public. But on the political culture, you're seeing basically some time between 2014 and 2016 as a tipping point in the nature, in particular of the relationship between the UK government and the devolved administrations, but possibly also in politics. So is that change around that point, do you see it being driven by who's in government in the UK level, the 2014 referendum or the 2016 referendum? Like, what's the trigger for you seeing that as the central move?
I think there's two components of that. There's the internal political culture of the Scottish Parliament, and there's the political culture as influenced by the engagement with the United Kingdom government. On the internal question in the Scottish Parliament, I think basically the nature of that culture has changed largely in the period around about 2014 because of the impact of the independence referendum, where I think the the pro-union parties are prepared to give much less ground or scope to an SNP government to act. And then also it's affected by the significant dominance, political dominance of the Parliament by the SNP electively. So that creates the internal culture of the SNP now. It wasn't like that before. If I go back to the 2007 to 2011 period where I was part of a minority government in which we had 47 out of 129 members. I remember being told we're having a minority government with 47 out of 129, thinking, how on earth is this going to work? But there was enough goodwill to get our way through that and to govern effectively and for Parliament to legislate effectively. So those numbers were not an impediment. But it did change with those factors. The second thing is the relationship with the UK government. And it does come back to my point about the UK government being quite a benign presence around about devolution for most of the last 25 years. I always felt that there's always prickly issues to resolve. I was a finance minister for many years. You never really have a discussion about money without it being a bit fraught, So there was always, but fundamentally good working arrangements. I think what changed was really around about, and actually I should say that in the period of the coalition government between the Conservatives and the Liberals, 2010 to 2015, I actually thought those years were probably the most respectful years in relation to the interaction between the devolved governments and the UK government. And I think that was the operating culture at that time was pretty good. It's gone.
Why did you go on? I did not expect you to say that. So why?
I think there was. I think the George Osborne and invariably Danny Alexander, Liberal Democrat, I think they both believed in the concept of devolution. So they were devolving power in England.
I see, yeah.
So it wasn't. So I can't remember all the structures that were going on in England, but they were tending to.
They were arguing for it, basically.
The Northern Powerhouse stuff and all that material. I felt that I was dealing with believers in devolution.
Okay.
And there were also at a personal level there was respectful relations. I have to say it's gone absolutely down the stank since Brexit, totally down the stank, and it's terrible just now. And so I'm able to say, I think fairly dispassionately, there have been really good periods of engagement. This is terrible.
Okay. So there's quite a few questions, and the gentleman and lady from the press have got themselves up and running. So this is a good day to hold a conference on devolution because there's things happening in Hollywood. I think you might have noticed. So there's two questions here. There's just one. What are you expecting to happen today? Where on earth is Scottish politics going?
Obviously, we face a difficult day today. The First Minister is, I understand, going to make a statement later on today. I think it's probably best at this stage if I let the First Minister speak for himself and to set out his position, and I'm quite sure more has to be said in the course of the rest of the day and the rest of the week.
There's one question more personally for you from Tim Wallace, who was it's a hypothetical question, and Tim is probably aware of how politicians often respond to hypothetical questions. But the question is, if the First Minister does step down, would you like to be First Minister? I think this might be an easy one, but
it is a hypothetical question. So I'm going to take the traditional approach of saying it's a hypothetical question. But I think it's a very demanding role to be the First Minister of Scotland. I've been very close to it for many years, so it takes a lot of thinking about.
Very good. Right, let's do one. Let's take one question from the floor, and then we'll do one each on tax and benefits, and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead, sir.
Lovely. Hi, John. Another Swinney, Paul Swinney from Centre for Cities. Don't often meet another Swinney.
All right.
Devolution, obviously agree that is a good thing, but in Scotland and in Wales it's sort of gone down to the national parliament but then hasn't gone any further, so there's been very little powers that are being passed down to a more local level. What's your reflection on that, and what do you think might happen in the future in that regard?
I think I generally come into my politics with the view that decisions are best taken as close to people as you possibly can do. So I do support empowering local authorities, and I think some headway has been made on that. The Scottish Parliament just now is legislating for a visitor levy bill, for example, which would give a local authority the power to decide if it wants to put an overnight charge on hotel accommodation, things like that. So that is one example of a re-empowerment of local authorities, and we have taken other steps to create that discretion. I think one of the challenges of that question is that often where powers are held by local authorities, it is often the Scottish Government held to account for the performance around those powers. So there's an issue about the degree to which, and it comes back to the point I was making a moment ago, that Holyrood has become the focal point of all political debate. So even though a local authority decision might be taken at the other end of the country, the implications of that tend to become the responsibility of the Scottish Government. And that's, that obviously raises some challenging questions about political accountability.
Right, let's take two quick questions and then wrap up. So go ahead, Lady.
Okay, thank you very much. You talked about skills development and the approach that you're taking in Scotland. It sounds as if you're moving towards the idea of a broader tertiary sector along the lines of Wales for post-compulsory education. From England, we look at post-compulsory education in Scotland and think, oh, they've got it wrong about fees because free university is great, but it limits participation. How do you square that circle, and what do you think England can learn from the approach that you're taking on skills development?
And let's just take one more question right at the back, so we're going to overrun.
Just turning to the events again today, would you be prepared to step in as SNP leader if it's what it takes to prevent a vote of no confidence in the Scottish Government?
Two rather different questions.
On the first question, the experience of, for example, providing free university tuition has led to an expansion of our participation in university education. It's led to an expansion of domiciled Scots participating in education. It's also led to, with the priorities we've applied on access to higher education, a greater proportion of young people from areas of deprivation accessing higher education. So I would contend that that has actually broadened participation. But I would also say, and the reason why I cited the apprenticeship options, is that I think what we've managed to make a lot of headway on is about aligning the requirements of the labour market with the arrangements within our college structure particularly. But your starting point of trying to create a more integrated tertiary sector is very much the policy objective, so that we try to blur some of those boundaries between what happens in a school, what happens in a college, what happens in a university, to enable a much more effective learner journey, which results in increased participation in the economy. So I think that's the principal lesson I would identify from the experience in Scotland. In relation to the question about events today, obviously the First Minister is going to make a statement later on. I will consider what the First Minister says and reflect on that. I think it's important that we hear very much what the First Minister says later on today, and I may well have more to say at a later stage during the week.
Great. Look, can we all thank Don for his remarks this morning, particularly for the reflective nature of them, which is quite unusual in our world. So thank you very much indeed for those. And we should also say, in a world where it does feel like politics, I don't want to say it's a fast churn game, but it's a faster churn game than it was 25 years ago, certainly, for people who are prepared to commit basically their entire working lives to politics and to public services, a thing that allows us to have this kind of reflective conversation. So thank you for those as well. So we can release you to what I'm sure isn't going to be the most relaxing day, John, but I hope you enjoyed the beginning of it for the very good. Thanks again, John. Now, for the rest of you, we're just going to do a quick set change because we need some more chairs, basically. So give us a second to do that, and then we're going to move on to, I don't think in the next question anyone's going to be asked would they like to lead a nation of the UK during it, but you never know. If you spot the next leader, then you can ask them a question. Now, this is going to run till about 11:15, and then I promise you're allowed some coffee just back up stairs, and then we will move through the two panels. We'll be the first panel, then the coffee, then back for the other panel, which means you mustn't be late back from coffee, otherwise we won't get to start the second panel in time. So, and though there are a few good questions online about tax and benefits in particular, so can those that ask those particularly about, why was there no really intention to have any of universal credit devolved during the Smith Commission? Is it a good idea to have had as big a divergence in tax policy in Scotland? I was up in Edinburgh actually when the Scottish budget last year happened. We are now talking about really quite chunky divergences in tax policy in Edinburgh now compared to the rest of the United Kingdom. So what are the lessons from that? So we're going to get into that in the next session. But to do that, I'm going to hand over to our brilliant chair, Claudia. There you go.
Thank you very much. Hello, hopefully you can all hear me okay. Thank you all very much for coming, and glad to see there's already been lots of audience participation. My name is Clodagh Rice. I'm the business correspondent at BBC Northern Ireland, and I'm delighted to be here. A big thank you to the Resolution Foundation for having me. It's not often that the devolved nations get to be in the spotlight, so I'm genuinely really excited to be here. As Torsten mentioned, this session is going to be on devolved taxes and benefits, something that has been certainly making the headlines in Northern Ireland. We have had a bit of an on-again, off-again government situation. We now have Stormont back up and running. And as of just last Thursday, we have agreed a budget. But, a lot of similar conversations are happening in Northern Ireland. None of the government ministers are happy with what they've got. And I suppose that then raises the question, if you aren't happy with your slice of the pie, what more could we do to make that pie bigger? And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. A few little housekeeping points. I know that obviously if you have any questions towards the end of the session, you can raise your hand. And I've also got the online system here if there's anyone watching online. We would love to hear your questions because we've got a very impressive lineup. So I'll ask them all to come up on the stage while I do some introductions. We're going to be joined by Emma Congreve, who's Deputy Director at the Fraser of Allender Institute, an experienced economist covering many economic and social policy issues, who previously worked at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and advised the Scottish Government. We're also joined by David Alsop, who is Chief Executive of the Welsh Revenue Authority, its first chief executive, and has been working in the role since 2016. He previously worked on reforming the local tax system and has worked at the Treasury and HMRC. And I'm hoping that we're also joined by Lindsay White. Great, delighted you could be here, Lindsay. Lindsay's Director General of International Finance at the Treasury and previously was Director of Personal Tax, Welfare and Pensions. And she worked on the domestic response to the pandemic, including the design and implementation of the furlough scheme and the self-employment support scheme. So delighted to have you here. And we will be shortly hearing a brief presentation from each of our speakers, and then we will kick things off with a few questions. So Emma, if you'd like to start us off.
Good morning. Great to be here with everyone. My name is Emma Congreve. I work at the... Oh, is my mic working okay? Yep. I work at the Fraser of Allender Institute. We're an economic research institute that does kind of independent analysis and scrutiny of economic, fiscal and social policy in Scotland. So I've got a few slides, hopefully. Yep, there we go, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the highs and lows that we've seen in Scotland with regards to devolution of benefits and taxes. So I've worked in Scotland since around 2007 as a civil servant and latterly on the other side. But yes, so originally from England, so I do obviously get to hear that perspective from my family members about what's going on in Scotland too. So helpfully, John Swinney went through most of these, so I don't need to. But basically, these are the three kind of big rafts of devolution for tax and benefits. There were quite a few in those early days. It wasn't just this the income tax varying powers. Council tax and non-domestic rates were also fully devolved at that point. Scotland Act 2012 brought in the stamp duty, landfill and more powers on income tax. Bit of a shout out to council tax benefit / reduction, which came as a result of UK welfare reform when it was devolved throughout England as well. Had to be called reduction in Scotland because at that point we weren't allowed to make any benefits. But that came in with the 2016 Scotland Act, where powers to create new benefits and to top up benefits came in, as well as the devolution of many of the disability and carer benefits, so PIP, carers allowance are now devolved, as well as further powers on income tax. So what are my highlights and lowlights? So everyone always talks about income tax, and it probably is the most high profile, most contentious. I'm not going to talk about it too much because everyone else does. In terms of the most frustrating area of tax and benefit devolution, the fact that we have done pretty much nothing in terms of reform of council tax or non-domestic rates. Yes, there's been tweaks around the edges. John Swinney talked about small business bonus scheme, although, yeah, quite whether that did what it was meant to do, jury's still out. But yes, we have not had a revaluation in Scotland for council tax. Wales managed it. So yes, it's hard, but yes, it could have been done. And we've had tweaks around the edges, which, you know, have made the system a bit more progressive, but we're still, yeah, so far away from where we need to be on reform of those taxes. And most interesting, Scottish Child Payment, which we've already heard a bit about, you know, genuinely a game-changing benefit for Scotland. It's a top-up benefit, so it's a top-up to universal credit. When you're looking at the formal legislation, we still have not created a new benefit in Scotland, which I'll come on to later, some of the reasons maybe why. And then the devolution of disability and carer benefits. It's taken a long time for the secure, safe and secure transition is always a term that's used to get it transferred from DWP to Social Security Scotland. That's now largely done, and there are potentially, that's the one to look out for in terms of changes. Lastly, these are some of my reflections on where we are. So I feel that we are probably in that position where a lot has happened, but the devolution framework, I think, and the way of operating is sort of still to mature, really. We still have a lot of discussion about what's happening in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK, or England and Wales. That's how policy making and the reaction still seems to be framed. There is an obsession about tax migration. It's how many questions and time is spent on that. And up until now, we've only really had anecdotes in terms of, you know, whether it makes people want to flee Scotland or maybe not move to Scotland, which is maybe a bit more along the right lines in terms of type of impact. Some work from HMRC out last week saying maybe tiny, some perhaps indication, but marginal. On the whole, we're not seeing people kind of fleeing to Berwick or Carlisle. And in fact, I think there's a counter to some of us. I mean, I'm paying more tax than I would do in England for my salary. I'm okay with that, and quite a lot of people are. So we're still yet to kind of get beyond the "ooh, boo, more tax in Scotland" type thing. Secondly, I noticed John Swinney didn't really talk about the fiscal framework, and luckily I don't have enough time to explain it to you because it is hugely complicated in terms of how it operates. I think there's only a handful of people in Scotland and there's a few in England who really can, you know exactly how it operates. Third one I've got here, restricted infrastructure and still a big reliance on UK government. So this comes into the fact that we still Scottish Child Payment Top-Up Benefit, we are still wholly reliant on information passed to us by DWP and HMRC in terms of working out who should be getting that benefit in Scotland. We do not have the infrastructure to means test and to have information on people living in Scotland. So if we were to create a new benefit, we would have no idea really how it would operate, who the people are. We probably need to get to a point where we do start to build up that kind of infrastructure so that we can actually create new benefits. Tax, sort of similar, it's Revenue Scotland, limited information, that the infrastructure is really the UK-wide infrastructure for collecting income tax. Still some way to go in that, and data as a result of all of that. You really want to know about what's happening with these people, what are some of the behaviour changes, all of those types of things. And we don't really have the data infrastructure to allow us to do that. And then lastly, I think there is still a lot of confusion and grey areas on the devolution settlement between what's actually, how it all actually works. This comes mainly from the fiscal framework, things like spillovers. So if Scottish Government does something which increases UK uptake of UK benefits, there could be a case for UK Government to claim some of that money back. With some news in today about PIP being changed significantly in England, that would remove that comparator between Scotland and UK for determining what the block grant adjustment would be. Does that mean that Scotland would lose out? Would the no detriment principle kick in? To be honest, you need a few days to work these things through. And it's really confusing. And I think it is of detriment to kind of policy making, because if journalists can't understand it, ministers just about maybe, civil servants hopefully. But yeah, it's a tricky one. So we're still trying to work it all out, I think. But so many interesting things have happened, and so much more potentially to happen. But yeah, we've still got some way to go.
Thank you so much, Emma. A lot of really interesting discussion points, but we'll try and leave that discussion to the end. So I'll hand over to David now, who's going to set out what his work does at the WRA.
Can you hear me? Is the first question. Yes, you can. Great, thank you. So thank you very much for the invitation. My name is David Alsop. I'm the Chief Executive of the Welsh Revenue Authority. It's probably a good idea to start with a little bit of context to explain what the Welsh Revenue Authority is and where we fit into this sort of wider story. So what I hope to do is just share a little bit of our experience of creating the WRA, but actually more about the experience we're having in trying to pursue and develop a Welsh way of doing tax. So the Welsh Revenue Authority, WRA, has been going since 2016, and we've been collecting taxes in Wales, since 2017, and we've been collecting taxes in Wales for 6 years now. We're part of the wider fiscal devolution of powers to Wales, and our role is to collect and manage the 2 devolved taxes. And at the outset, perhaps it's also important to point out that the legislation that creates the powers for the WRA largely mirrors that which exists in the UK context as well. Indeed, actually, of course, the taxes that were devolved also existed in the UK context, and of course existed in Wales for a long time before we were responsible for collecting and managing them. So we had, when we started out, a similar legislative basis, a taxpayer agent community that were used to handling these same taxes. So what could we do to create a bit of something that was tailored to the needs of Wales? So I think that was exactly our ambition, was to create something which felt that it was tailored to the circumstances of Wales, that was also reflective of the fact that we're an organisation that started so recently. What does that feel like? An organisation that's fresh and new, perhaps, and also appropriate to our scale and scope. And I think, above all else, how I would describe this as being an act of collective ongoing reimagination. We're trying to continuously think, how might this work? How might we do this in our way? And there have been lots of elements to that. Some of them have been deliberate, some of them have been accidental, many of them have just been necessary. But one aspect I think that I would like to share with you a little bit today is the work that we've done to try and think about how do we describe the relationship that we want to have, how do we describe that social contract between ourselves and taxpayers. And I'd like to say that this was a flash of inspiration, but in fact, to some degree, it was an accidental consequence of having had conversations with some of my colleagues doing this work through the medium of Welsh. So we had a conversation about what was it we were trying to do, and I think I have a slide here which hopefully I can bring up. Yes, so our inspiration was drawn from the Welsh language. So we discussed what sort of relationship did we want to try and encourage between ourselves and agents, taxpayers in Wales. And we lighted on three terms which we thought were, explaining what we thought we were trying to do. We like the fact that they're sort of, alliterative and they feel like a snappy, some sort of strapline. And then we realised, actually, the only issue is that when we tried to translate them back out of Welsh into English, they don't really work in the same way. So just to sort of give you an example, cywiro at the bottom there is translated probably as correct in English. But the issue of doing that is it a verb or is it a noun? And of course, words have baggage to them. So I always think of someone's sort of red pen when I'm thinking of the notion of to correct. And similarly, cadarnhau is a word that is an ongoing process. If you translated it literally, it's probably confirm, which feels like something that's happened once, the conclusion of a transaction. Whereas cadarnhau talks about something which is an ongoing process and an enduring one. So having alighted on some words that we thought encapsulated what it was we were trying to do, and realised that that work wasn't really ideal if you wanted then just to translate it back, that's forced us to do something which perhaps we wouldn't have done otherwise, which is talk an awful lot about what that relationship really means to us. And I guess that the effort to explain ourselves, and as you can see from this slide, the words are in Welsh, but all the explanations in English, it's not translated because it just doesn't work. And so it forces us to have a longer, more meaningful conversation with taxpayers' agents, with stakeholders and others, getting that buy-in, and of course, across the organisation too. I think what's happened with hindsight is that these words have given energy and meaning to a Welsh way of doing tax. They've perhaps also allowed us to feel a sense of identity attached to the way in which we go about doing tax in Wales. And I think they explain in part the very positive feedback we get from taxpayers and their agents, and the way the organisation's culture works, and the sort of level of engagement that we have. Just a simple citing of that might be that for those of you who follow engagement scores across the civil service, over the last 6 years, the Welsh Revenue Authority has always been in the top 3 out of more than 110 organisations. And that's, large, small, new or old organisations. So there's something about the way that the culture of the organisation is aligned to something which feels like it's ours and is about trying to forge a different relationship, a reimagining process. But this is a work in progress, so we now have the interesting challenge of supporting Welsh Government in developing the visitor levy, and so it's again a chance to collaborate, work closely with others and think afresh about how we can continue that process of reimagining what should the state's relationship be with the citizen in terms of how that interaction on tax works. So yeah, that's my thoughts.
Thank you very much, David. And now we'll lastly be hearing from Lindsay White from the Treasury. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much indeed, and a huge thank you to Torsten and the Resolution Foundation for inviting me along to this event. I suspect some of you looking at the profile were wondering why on earth is this woman who is the Director General for International Finance appearing at this devolution event. But actually the part in my career that I think has led to this invitation is that I was responsible for leading the Treasury's devolution team that was stood up in the run-up to the Scotland referendum. So I thought I would talk a little bit about my experience of how the Treasury's role in devolution has changed over time. And it was a real pleasure to listen to John Swinney's talk earlier on. And I was particularly delighted to hear, although he was talking about the political relationship, but him pointing to that period of time as one of kind of respect and really constructive operating relationships, because that was certainly my experience as an official through that process, that consistently our ability to work very closely through the technical detail with colleagues in the Scottish Government was a really important part of being able to support ministers both through the Smith Commission process and then subsequently through the fiscal framework negotiation, even though of course we were in different positions about what that should look like overall. But just to kind of explain my role and how it sort of changed through that. So I, just before the referendum, I was running the local government spending and growth team in the Treasury, and actually kind of linked to Mr. Swinney's comments, we had the kind of day-to-day devolved administration spending team was part of that. So we had a real connection internally in the Treasury between how we were thinking about devolved spending in all of its senses. Now at that time, most of what we were involved in doing was sort of cranking the Barnett formula, so working really closely with the finance teams in each of the 3 devolved administrations, particularly through spending review periods, but also, of course, there are always like technical challenges around that. But we're only starting to have to deal with some of the interactions with kind of wider tax devolution at that point. The Welsh Government hadn't yet used the Welsh rate of income tax. The Scottish Government had only just started to do that. But then the role changed obviously very significantly when we sort of stood up a sort of separate standalone devolution team in the run-up to the referendum, because we knew that in the event that the referendum result was in favour of staying in the Union, that we were going to have to move, well, it was much faster than we imagined, but we were going to have to move really very quickly into a period of much more significant devolution to Scotland. All 3 of the Unionist parties had obviously set out their kind of independent commissions looking at the broad areas. So we sort of knew that we knew the broad scope, and it was very clear that income tax devolution was going to be front and centre for that. So then, as it happens, that was set up really within days of the result of the referendum. I remember being at Clapham Junction train station at about 4 a.m, hearing the referendum result and knowing at that point what role the team was going to have from kind of that morning. And it was, I mean, I can't remember exactly the time frame, but it was sort of later that day or the next day, I think even, that Lord Smith was appointed to chair that commission. And at that point, as many of you will know, the UK government was not part of the Smith Commission, but we did have a role, and my role in the Treasury was to coordinate our part of the economic evidence to submit to the Smith Commission. The members of the Commission from each of the parties were able to come and ask us for technical advice about the range of tax, welfare and spending issues that were part of the Commission's scope. I mean, this is a huge array of incredibly technical policy areas to have to pick up and run with in a very short period of time. And then laterally, as it became clear what the broad shape of the package looked like, the UK government, and it was me that was sent, were invited to a meeting of the Smith Commission to talk through what this might mean for the wider fiscal framework for Scotland. And that then led to the Smith Commission agreeing that there should be a negotiation to agree a new fiscal framework in light of the really significant new powers that were being devolved. At the same time, my team again was closely involved in conversations with both the Welsh Government and the Northern Ireland Executive in very different contexts. So with the Welsh Government, the Welsh Government had made a very compelling case that because of the different population dynamics, the Barnett formula over time was really disadvantaging the Welsh Government and the sort of spending per head, and that would not be sustainable for the future. So they made a very compelling case, and we embarked on a similarly very technical negotiation to agree a new funding floor, which would then have to interact with the Welsh rate of income tax. And with the Northern Ireland executive, at the time there were huge political stresses there, the root cause of which was around the implementation of the then government's welfare policies that was bringing the Northern Ireland executive to the brink of political breakdown. So there were a number of kind of negotiations, and subsequently the sort of Stormont House deal that helped to hold that together in that instance. And again, economic levers were right at the heart of that. So it had its roots in a difference of political view about welfare policy, but also some real challenges in terms of the Northern Ireland executive's ability to fund the welfare reforms within their budget. But also tax policy loomed large in that as well, with the kind of ongoing debate about the devolution of corporation tax. So, I mean, I should say it's one of the periods of my career that I enjoyed the most, and I'm most proud of being part of those processes. It's a kind of real privilege of being a civil servant that you can find yourself working on issues that really genuinely matter to our citizens, and that period was definitely one of those periods where it was an extraordinarily complicated set of issues, technically and politically, and that was made even more complicated by the fact that we were also at the time looking at potential constitutional reforms in the UK through the work on English votes for English laws. And that, I mean, the Scotland Fiscal Framework and the Welsh funding floor are extraordinarily complicated technically. I think they maybe come second to trying to work out voting procedures across elements of tax and spending in a world of English votes for English laws. The sort of final things I wanted to say, just by way of introduction, and of course happy to answer questions about any of this, is that throughout this period there's been a huge process of capability building across the UK civil service, but I've also seen that front and centre within the Treasury, reflecting the really different nature of the fiscal frameworks that we now have with each of the devolved administrations. We still have the devolution team that I was responsible for running. It's large by Treasury team standards. I think that is really important. But we have increasingly embedded understanding and devolution capability in more of our standing policy teams. So as you mentioned in the introduction, I spent a period of time as Director for Personal Tax, Welfare and Pensions. And certainly my personal tax team was completely embedded with the devolution team. Anywhere we've been making decisions, and this happens much more often now, well, I say making decisions, advising ministers on decisions that bring together tax and spending policy, those are now much more complicated. So you've only got to think of things like the apprenticeship levy or the health and social care levy as examples of where you can no longer make those, design those policies solely with UK income tax in mind. So that is definitely a journey, but there's a really far improved kind of programme of like capability building and training across the civil service. I would also say that it remains our experience that the ability of civil servants across each of the devolved administrations to work together technically through these issues remains very strong. So again, as John Swinney said, although of course there are difficult issues and there are difficult points of interpretation and how things like the frameworks operate, the vast majority of issues are dealt with very smoothly at technical level and kind of worked through. And I think that's a really important part of our ongoing ability to support ministers, whatever the politics are in each of those governments. And then the very final thing that I would say is I think it's really important in any decision in any sort of conversation about spending and economic policy and economic growth to also have an eye to UK-wide spending that is clearly really significant in all parts of the United Kingdom. As you say, I've been in recent years very closely involved in that where it came to COVID support for households, including what we were able to do through the welfare system. But in my current job, I've actually just slightly unexpectedly just come back from supporting the Chancellor on his trip to Kyiv as part of the announcement of the commitment to reaching 2.5 in defence spending and increasing our military support in money and gifting for Ukraine this year. And that was just a very powerful reminder of, particularly in this theatre, of the critical role that the UK plays internationally and the impact that those spending decisions have in kind of leading in NATO, and even more importantly, the very practical impact some of those decisions will have for Ukrainian forces on the front line. So I'll stop there, and thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you to all of you who have already been sending in your questions. Emma, I'll start off with yourself because I love that you had the kind of most frustrating elements and kind of wanted to pick up on that, in terms of why you think there hasn't been movement on those issues. Is it political leadership or the political capacity to do so?
Yeah, I think there were a number of factors. I think we've seen as more devolution has come, when we've had the additional, say, stamp duty and then income tax and social security, I think they've kind of, hogged the limelight a bit. They're new, they're shiny. So lots of things have been, it's like, oh, we should do something about these. And so they that has happened. Council tax and non-domestic rates have been devolved a long time, and there wasn't much in those in the first two terms, I suppose, on those areas. Other things such as land reform took up, maybe rightly so, the bulk of the the sort of political time there. So I think it's not been a priority. It wasn't a priority then, and now we're just in that position where, yes, it's so hard to make big changes to them. I was involved on one of the reviews of council tax on the Secretariat back when I was a civil servant, and despite coming up with all the answers, they were not politically acceptable ones. So yes, it needs bravery, and non-domestic rates, I think, is the same. The businesses are crying out for reforms, and it's within the gift of the Scottish Government, and so it's one where I think the Scottish Government and the Scottish Executive, before they just changed their name, the same thing, has failed in those regards of doing what was required.
Yeah, well, I think that's really interesting because from a Northern Irish perspective, it was about 2 years ago now, we had an independent fiscal commission that was set up, led by Paul Johnson, to look at what would be the most appropriate economic devolution for Northern Ireland, and their report found that it would be partial devolution of income tax. And there were so many concerns raised about the political capacity to actually take that on because of the obvious potential risks as well as rewards. And so, yeah, that conversation hasn't really gone anywhere from our point of view. We've also had a question here that if I can work out how to put this on the screen, hopefully it will come up for you, Emma. Oh, I have just done the opposite of what I was trying to do. Well, excuse me. It was basically saying that you made the case that over 25 years there hasn't been a massive amount of new things that were done, and it was saying what would the implications then be from the perspective of Holyrood. I'll try and find this one back again. Yes, it says, Professor David Bell has said that Holyrood has had little or no impact on economic performance. No new benefit in 25 years, says Emma. Settlement increasingly questioned. Was it worth it? And where would we start now? Quite a few questions there.
I know Professor David Bell quite well. I'm sure he didn't quite mean no impact at all.
That might have been an oversimplification.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say it doesn't always feel like we've got a million miles or as far as we could have done, I suppose. We do have to remember that in terms of economic levers, Scotland doesn't have all of them, and some of the really important ones around such things like migration, it definitely doesn't have. We also do not have very much in the way of borrowing powers. So sometimes I lose a bit of patience with SNP, Scottish Government ministers saying, one hand tied behind our back, when I'm like, well, there's all these things you could have done over here and you haven't done them. So, maybe you should think a bit more about that. But at the same time, powers are limited. I think some of the economic woes facing Scotland are very similar to what's facing the rest of the UK. But yes, in my view, devolution has led to different choices being made in a number of areas. Yeah. Whether or not you think it's worth it is probably a personal thing, but certainly I think it's done what it was intended to do.
We've had another question here. I'll see if I'm more successful this time, and if not, I'll just read it. Saying, Andy Burnham today has stated, if re-elected, I will start negotiations with Whitehall for more devolved control of benefits, including disability benefits. Do you believe benefits can be devolved to hyper-localised institutions, for example, to the English city regions? Lindsay, I'll maybe put that one to you, because I know you've done a lot of work on welfare, and actually I love hearing the kind of behind the scenes element of the amount of including teams for the devolved nations. Is there much of a conversation about this in terms of how to tailor things to specific English regions?
It's not an area of policy I work on directly at the moment. So, but I can definitely reflect back on the period that I was there. I would say that a lot of the focus started in how you could come up with more innovative financing mechanisms to devolve more kind of directly economic growth levers. So in the case of Manchester, for example, we had quite a long negotiation about this kind of earn back model, I think, which would enable kind of longer term investment, particularly targeting things like ability to invest in local infrastructure. I think part of the challenge with that has always been to marry up a focus on how you can better support local public service delivery with local economic growth investment, because those two things really have to go hand in hand. And I think that has been much harder for government, even setting aside the politics and views about the sort of principles of devolution. There are kind of huge practicalities around kind of data and ability of public services operating locally to work together. And there are, of course, some amazing examples of where that does happen brilliantly, but certainly at the time that I was doing that was very dependent on the individuals finding innovative ways that they could join up and support specific families. So the Troubled Families Initiative is a kind of one of the biggest examples of that. I think where it comes to the kind of devolution of benefits, I think, and this was the case in the negotiations around the Smith Commission, you can see it's the benefits that are, as it were, a bit further away from the labour market, which is possible to manage a bit more directly through government policy, are easier to devolve. Then it becomes a bit of a question about the sort of local revenue raising potential against the likely demand for those benefits in the area. I think it's much harder, obviously, and that's one of the reasons we didn't go down routes of sort of devolving universal credit for certainly a much more localised area like a city region to take on responsibility for something that has potentially such big swings in overall costs with the economic cycle.
Yeah, we've had another great question here that says, how can the UK government reduce the blurred lines between being a UK and an English government? I don't know, Lindsay, if you would have anything to say on this point.
I think everybody on the panel will have something to say about this. Maybe the first thing I would say is I absolutely work for the UK government.
Yeah.
All of us think of ourselves as working for the UK government and for all of the people of the UK. You can probably tell from my accent that I am Scottish. I'm very proudly Scottish. But I do think that there are clearly long-running, like, political and constitutional issues around the question of, well, I mentioned English votes for English laws in an English Parliament. That is, I was going to say, well above my pay grade. It's both that and also a political set of decisions, obviously. I do think, though, and it's something that we've reflected on sort of through, certainly through the fiscal framework negotiations in Scotland, that the UK government could often do a better job of explaining the policies that we are responsible for, getting out and about around the UK to be able to do that. I think your point,
that
Emma,
ties in nicely with what Emma was saying. You know,
no one can
and
understand it.
I also think that's a really important point. You also mentioned the media. You know, I am lucky to have had briefings about fiscal frameworks and Barnett formulas, and then trying to pitch that in the morning meeting, you know, in 30 seconds. They're like, great, so we're gone, we've lost you. You know, like, how important, or, you know, is there a responsibility then in terms of how we can open up that conversation, maybe try and clarify some of those grey areas that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think there is a lot there. I mean, sometimes I do wonder if, some people just forget that some things are default. I don't know. There was one recently with discussion of the work capability assessment being removed and being replaced by PIP eligibility. And nowhere in any of the papers around that could I see anyone saying, oh, it would have to be different in Scotland because PIP doesn't exist anymore. But yeah, so the things like that, and it's just that confusion. And obviously when journalists will ask us for help, and we're like, well, we think it could be this. So there has to be a big job, a better job, I think, of just simplifying these things for people and not, and any kind of policy that's coming out of UK government. I think the media has a big role in this for reporting on English policy. You know, we all have to watch the UK news, and unfortunately up in Scotland and Wales as well, and Northern Ireland. And when you talk about, oh, the government has decided to change health policy, well, in England and Wales, you know. But you never get that
One of my real Northern Ireland pet peeves is always the journalists, my own colleagues, who are asking me about the energy price cap, which we don't have in Northern Ireland. And, you know, like, we've been talking about this now, you know, it's been in the headlines for months. Yeah. And I was asked again at the end of March, what about the latest, you know, and it's like, you know, I think there does need to maybe be more a kind of appreciation of the unique circumstances that each of the nations are coming from. Yeah. David, I'm keen to get your thoughts on this question too, on the blurring of these lines. You know, do you think there is more work that needs to be done in this respect?
I was going to answer it by sort of turning it on its head a little bit and saying that actually the fact that there's some blurred lines is quite helpful behind the scenes. Because the relationship we have with colleagues in HMRC and in Revenue Scotland, etc., is fabulous, and it's, you know, it seems to me that there's an awful lot of learning that's going on. Obviously, the circumstances of an organisation the size and scale of what I am the chief executive for versus HMRC are very different, but we're doing a similar thing, and so there's a lot of sort of, you know, sharing of, you know, people's careers, all that kind of thing, and lots of sharing of knowledge and experience. So. It's probably not answering that question, but that was the thing that came to my mind when I thought about it.
But I love to hear that, because I sort of, you know, I also like to hear that there could be positives in terms of we are trying to work this, maybe not to your advantage as such, but, you know, that it's an important way of working, you know, in terms of collaboration.
Yeah.
We've also had another here that I'll maybe put to all of you. Do you have any views? We'll start with you, David. Do you have any views on the appropriate rules or collaboration and competition between the administrations and revenue authorities across the UK, both in terms of policy and administration performance?
So I think on policy is probably not my territory, given that I'm responsible for the administration of
from an administration point of view.
But on the administration side. So one of the things I didn't talk about in my presentation is we have quite a different attitude towards the use of metrics in the Welsh Revenue Authority. So we don't have some of the metrics which you might expect tax authorities to have that look at an emphasis on the amount of additional resources that are brought in from the activities that the tax authority does. We feel that that's because it has the potential to contaminate the relationship of trust that you want to have. If your taxpayer and their agent thinks that the role of the tax authority is always to be looking for a bit more money, how does that feel, right? So actually, we have somewhat of an interesting challenge in comparing ourselves, because some of the metrics that we use and the way we report about it and the way we talk about it in annual reports, the way we publish stuff is very different. So that's a little bit challenging anyway, but quite interesting. Another example of that might be, for example, we do publish the amount of tax we think has been incorrectly paid per year, and within that we also publish how much of that we think is overpayment. Which consistently there is, which might surprise people. And we try and put as much effort into the pursuing of overpayment as we do underpayment. Again, all part of that sort of trying to engender a sense of trust. So, again, I think I've not answered your question because I'm just pointing out that sometimes it's quite difficult to compare if you've pursued different routes and if you try to sort of imagine your role in a slightly different way.
Yeah, no, and in fairness, I totally appreciate that, because again, coming from a Northern Ireland point of view, there are some stats and things that it's difficult to compare. Yeah. We don't have the data that we need. I'll maybe put the same question to you, Lindsay, from a kind of more policy point of view. You know, do you think that there should be more competition or collaboration between the devolved nations authorities?
I mean, I would say that I'm definitely in favour of collaboration, and I would just completely endorse all of the points about the administrative collaboration.
Yeah.
We've obviously got some formal routes through which that is really important, but actually, because we have been sort of evolving these frameworks, it is really important that administrations are working through the operational elements of that together. I mean, in policy terms, I mean, that was front and centre in a lot of the negotiations that I was involved in. We certainly tended to avoid devolving, for example, areas of tax that we thought would just lead to displacement between different nations. So the sort of long-running negotiations around air passenger duty for the Welsh government were an example of that. It was also, you know, part of the conversation about corporation tax for Scotland, because, you know, we are the UK, and, you know, for the overall sort of good of the country and citizens, that kind of displacement is not necessarily the most efficient route to that, but also it means that you've got to put in place all sorts of incredibly complicated spillover frameworks to try and mitigate it. So
yeah, and actually there was a question that had alluded to that. It was around, I've managed to have lost it again, but it was for Emma, and it was around the Scottish income tax bans and the issue of leakage. And, you know, do you think that there could be more should be done in that respect?
In terms of people leaving Scotland
yes.
as a result of it.
Which I appreciate, you know, I'm not saying that we're all going to flee or, you know, that everyone's going to flee automatically. And as you say, there are a lot of people who are very willing to, you know, make these very informed choices, but, you know, do you think there is maybe more work that should be done there to try and maybe counteract that narrative?
Yeah, well, luckily, I mean, that actually is the case. So just last week we had some reports out from HMRC, which we'd helped peer review as well. So, you know, they are, HMRC along with the Scottish Government do want to get as much evidence as possible to understand what is happening as a result of the different tax rates. It's in everyone's benefit to understand that. I think there's, as I said in my presentation, there's maybe been a bit too much focus on this when it's for a relatively small group of people that it actually matters. And up until this point, we haven't really had much firm evidence. It's all been anecdotal, you know. I heard of this person who didn't move to Scotland as a result of this, or this business is having to pay Scotland waiting to encourage people to move here. So I think it's maybe a little bit overblown, but yes, of course, it's so important to have that evidence, but that evidence does take time to come through. Yeah. We're still quite
And I suppose that's also part of the point, you know, we're having this conversation after 25 years of devolution because it is constantly evolving.
Yeah. But yeah, it is this kind of almost this natural experiment that we've got going on. which economists love. So there's loads to find out. But yeah, I think and it's part of the Scottish Government's calculations and the Fiscal Commission. I think the bigger thing actually is around behaviour change in terms of people changing hours of work, or maybe or changing their mind in terms of whether to go for a higher paid job, given the sort of pros and cons. I think that's where most of the kind of the work has been in terms of working this out, and over time we'll get more evidence to see what's actually happened.
Yeah. David, we've had another question for you. Are there any other Welsh words that your team have found interesting, different, useful in developing a tax system through Welsh? I'm personally loving learning all the Welsh words.
So you might think that my dictionary only ends at the letter C. There is one other term that I think is quite interesting. And one of the words we talked about is a word cymorth. There are a couple of people who speak Welsh in the audience, which would literally translate as being support or help. But it's sort of early usage of the word was always about sort of rural practices of helping each other out to, perhaps all getting together to plough one field one day, and then all getting together to plough somebody else's the next, or help with the harvest, or whatever it might be. And in other words, that word has always been imbued in Wales with a sense of reciprocity. And so there's the idea of support, but reciprocal. If I could find a way of putting that extra C in somewhere on the line, I suspect it's a policy matter rather than an administrative thing. But there is just something about the idea of reciprocity, I think, that is really important in how we think about, obviously, tax as a thing.
Great, we've got a question from the floor as well. If we could get a microphone over, please.
Relevant Scotland, but also perhaps the other regions as well. We've talked a little bit about economic performance and potential malaise or drift, let's say, over the last 10 years or so. Maybe more specifically for Kirsty, what's been your experience of the Scotland Office and the role of the Scotland Office directly within that, and what could be done through the Scotland Office to drive more economic progress or teeth within that without opening up the devolution settlement? And does a realignment of the politics in the next sort of 2-3 years in the UK to Scotland with a Labour political component make that teeth of the Scotland Office more obvious?
Is that one for Emma?
You said Kirsty.
Sorry, yes.
Lindsay?
Sorry, for Lindsay. Sorry.
Lindsay.
So we worked really, really closely with the Scotland Office through all of the work for the Smith Commission and all of the subsequent work on the fiscal framework and the Scotland Act. I think they play a really important role a couple of really important roles in helping to bring together all the different parts of Westminster who are thinking about interrelated policy issues. And just reinforcing for all of us where decisions are potentially going to be incoherent or disproportionate in their impact. I mean, of course, we hear that directly from the devolved administrations as well, but within the UK government, they play that part very strongly. And then I think that the kind of other side of the coin is going back to this point about how best to explain what the UK government is doing and how some of these systems work, and facilitating the engagement of the rest of Whitehall with the both with the administrations in each of the devolves, but also more broadly with the Scottish public, think tanks, etc., to try and make sure that they're holding our feet to the fire and being much more kind of open and transparent and engaging outwards.
I could just add,
of course.
Add a little bit to that. I mean, I think there is a perception, I think, Scotland drifting, not doing as well economically. But I think it is relatively marginal when it comes down to it, in terms of we're not, falling off a cliff whilst the UK economy, takes off. Like, it's
that is not happening.
No, we are all bumping along the bottom somewhat, and the causes of that are things that that maybe you could say were more in the control of the UK government than Scotland. And I mean, I think the Scottish office is having more of a role. I think I've certainly found them to become a bit more visible in recent years, particularly with some of the work around city deals. But yeah, it's in terms of how that's been handled and the levelling up discussions, you know, in terms of actually, is it doing the most it could do for economic growth and for spreading the prosperity in the way it could. I think politics has got caught up in a lot of that as well. So yeah, I think both have a role, but it's not easy, is it?
We have another question here. I'm not too sure who to put this to, so I might just see which of you is willing to speculate on this. I appreciate it might be above your pay grade or station. It's really more of a statement. Is it unrealistic to think that English tax levels can stay where they are with the investment needed in public services, etc.? And should the debate be reversed and the question asked of why England is not raising certain taxes? I'm sure it's probably because it's wildly politically unpopular. But yeah, Emma.
I think maybe I'm the only one.
Yeah, potentially.
Without getting into trouble. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it has been so interesting in Scotland seeing what's happened over recent years in terms of the tax changes, and what actually, you know, and what the discussion has been. I remember it was a couple of years ago, and I went on after one of the Scottish budgets. I went on Moneybox to discuss it, and they'd been around in Glasgow doing vox pops with people, and they said to me before we went on, they were like, "It was really strange. We couldn't really find anyone who disagreed with the taxes going up. We thought everyone would hate it." And we're like, you know, it is a slightly different debate, I think, up in Scotland about some of these things, and maybe it's the case in Wales and Northern Ireland as well. It is polarising. Some people hate it and are just like, we should never have done that. But I think a lot of people are like, well, if it's to invest in public services, and particularly when people think about the NHS, they're like, well, yeah, I think we probably...
Yeah, and it maybe ties into that kind of education piece. If people can realise, well, you know, if it is going towards one of our wider economic goals, whether that's, you know, child poverty rates, or, you know, that people are kind of thinking, well, this is something that, you know.
And the other thing to mention is that there is actually quite a lot of support across most of the Scottish Parliament. I mean, I know everything's up in the air today and it looks like everyone hates each other, but actually, you know, things like child poverty targets, things like the Social Security Act pretty much went through with broad support across the Parliament. So there's maybe more support across the Parliament than there is in Westminster as well.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all so much to each of our panellists, and thank you for all of your great questions. I appreciate a lot of these things, like fiscal frameworks, are very difficult to try and sum up in 30 seconds, but that's why it was great to have, you know, an important discussion where we got a bit more time to do that. So a round of applause for all of our panellists. We're going to take a short break, grab a tea or coffee, and we'll be back at 11:30. Thank you.
So all, another C word in Welsh for the dictionary for you aficionados from earlier. I'm Dewi Knight. I'm the Director of PolicyWise, and thanks again to all our speakers this morning. In this session, we're going to move on from powers and taxation and on to prosperity, or rather how we think of and measure prosperity and national well-being in a different way, and what do devolved approaches and their international influences tell us about this. Before I hand over to Clodagh, I'll just take a moment to say a few words about PolicyWise and why we're so pleased to have partnered with the Resolution Foundation for this conference to enable cross-nation learning. PolicyWise is the first and only UK and Ireland comparative policy research initiative. We're hosted by the Open University, and we work to change and improve how governments, parliaments and researchers across our nations work together to solve policy challenges. We do this through a unique comparative policy approach, bringing people and research together to help find solutions facing all policymakers. This includes UK and Ireland briefings, cross-government projects, policy research, training and events. And as part of this, we think that economic and fiscal devolution and the learning from it has been a little overlooked, just as Torsten said earlier. So we're delighted that today's discussions have proved to be so popular, offering a range of perspectives and will hopefully lead to more cross-nation learning and research. And we will be publishing a write-up of today's discussions in due course. Many thanks to Tara, Rob and Torsten at the team at Resolution Foundation and all our speakers today for their partnership on this event. So with that, I'll hand over to Clodagh and our panel. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome back. I hope you all had time to get a tea and coffee. And thank you all for your continued attention and participation. So, yes, I'm going to introduce the second panel today, which is going to look at spending and strategy and how the different devolved nations have prioritised their spending towards wider economic goals. We're also going to be discussing the idea of how do you measure success and prosperity and what sort of opportunities and challenges the devolved nations have faced over the last 25 years. So I'd like to invite each of our speakers onto the stage. We're going to be hearing from David Phillips, Associate Director at the IFS. David's works on devolved and local government finance, particularly the distribution of funding, incentives and risks and responses to those risks. He's also worked on the fiscal framework in Scotland and Wales. I'm also joined by another representative from Northern Ireland on this panel, Professor Katie Hayward, Professor of Political Sociology at Queen's University Belfast. Katie is also co-director of the Centre for International Borders Research, and her work focuses in Northern Ireland and the Republic on things like border management, EU integration, Brexit and peace and conflict processes. And finally, also we're joined by Jonathan Tench, Director of Wellbeing, Economy and Programmes at the Future Generations Commission. He supports the team's international work and leads on private sector engagement. So thank you all very much for joining us. And a very similar setup, housekeeping-wise, to the last panel. We'll be hearing a short presentation from each of our speakers, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions and discussions at the end. So we'll kick things off with you, David Phillips from the IFS. Thank you.
Great, thank you, and good afternoon. So, unusually, no slides, no charts, no tables, but there are numbers, I'm afraid. So I'm going to focus on public service spending, and I'll kick off by talking a little bit about some of the facts and figures, and then move on to why I think this kind of relates a bit to some extent, economic policy, but more generally, a sort of a different vision of the role of the state in Scotland compared to certainly England. So the first fact, Scottish public service spending is substantially higher. And it's higher than in Northern Ireland even, and it's higher than in Wales, and it's on 25% higher per person. 25% higher per person than in, this is awkward now, at the Coca Band. Stop singing. Let me go where I was. Spending per person is around 25% higher than it is in England. That has sort of oscillated over time, but it's been at a similar level since devolution. Now, given the geographic, demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of Scotland, spending needs are probably higher. But I don't think you'd find any sort of person without skin in the game who thinks that public service spending needs are 25% higher in Scotland than they are in England. Now, the gap is bigger for capital spending than it is for day-to-day spending. When we looked at this in the late 2010s, it was around 45% higher for capital spending. Now, in part, that's because the Scottish Government can borrow £450 million per year for capital investment, subject to an overall cap. Now, that cap is getting closer, so the Scottish Government is going to have to cut back its borrowing to remain below that cap. And that means, if anything, in the next few years, capital spend will be cut further in Scotland than it is in the rest of the UK. So that's an important issue for public investment in Scotland going forwards. So fact one, higher spending, particularly on capital investment. Fact two, spending per person is higher on nearly all areas of public service spending, but it differs vastly between public services. So the gap currently is about 1% for health. It's 15% for public order and safety, 20% for education, 37% for transport, 45% for environmental protection, 76% for recreation and culture. So higher spending across the board, but very different degrees of extra spending across services. Now for economic development and economic support, the figures recently are affected by COVID, which is classified under that area of spending. But if you look back at 2018-19, the last figures from before COVID is around 50% higher in Scotland and England. That's actually higher than in Wales and Northern Ireland too, substantially poorer than Scotland. Okay, so fact 3. The changes in spending on different services have been quite different over time in Scotland. Not just the levels, that's not just something that's been the same since devolution, it has changed over time. So health spending in Scotland was 22% higher than in England at the point of devolution. It was around 10% higher by the end of the 2000s, 3% higher by the end of the 2010s, and I said about 1% higher now. So there's been this kind of convergence in health spending in Scotland to the sort of English level. Now, part of that perhaps reflects definitions and policy choices in the sort of related areas. So social care, adult social care spending, that is higher in Scotland, and it has got increasingly higher. It was 27% higher at the point of devolution, it's now 47% higher. But even if you kind of combine those two figures and you look at health and social care together, it's gone from 23% down to 7% higher over the last 24, 25 years or so. That's quite a big change over time. Now, that's not because, as I said, spending in Scotland has converged to English levels. Across the board, spending is slightly lower perhaps, but you know, it's been about 25% to 30% across the period since devolution. Now, that means Scottish Government's been spending more on other areas of spending. And the biggest such area is education. And this is in spite of the share of young people in Scotland falling compared to England. Now, part of this relates to higher education, where, of course, Scotland has free tuition. And part of that then relates to the kind of accounting treatments of sort of tuition loans that are written off, which are not counted as education spending in England, versus the government spending on free tuition in Scotland, which is counted. But that's only part of the story. It's not just higher education, that's that sort of statistical issue. Recent years have also seen a big increase in school spending in Scotland compared to England. So by 2021-22, we estimate spending on schools in Scotland was 25% per person or per pupil higher than in England for those aged 3 to 18. It was only 4% in 2009-10. So there's been this big shift towards education away from health in terms of the Scottish Government's budget. Transport spending is relatively higher than the outset of the devolution, although not as high as it was in the sort of late 2000s, early 2010s. Recreation and culture spending has increased, so has agriculture and rural affairs spending. So at a very high level, compared to England, there's been this shift in spending away from healthcare towards those sort of services that are more traditionally thought about as being related to economic development, education, transport, and then support for particular areas of the economy. Now, I don't overplay this. I don't think this really was about economic policy per se. I think there were other factors underlying this. But I think it is worth noting. Now, if we look at policies rather than just spending, I think we find many examples of devolution in action. There was a question earlier about, has devolution not mattered? Well, I think it really has mattered, not just because of these big level sort of changes in spending, but also because the sort of minutiae of the policy changes as well. Now, I won't give a sort of comprehensive list of how I think policies in Scotland have differed compared to England or Wales. But I will say one sort of key thing on this. If you look at the policies the Scottish Government has been pursuing, and to a greater or less extent, while the opposition parties have been also supporting, whether in Parliament or putting in their manifestos, I think there is a Scottish model of the state and of economic development which increasingly differs from England. So on the public service or benefits in kind side, this model provides a wider range of free universal services that in England are often means tested. So things like higher education, personal care, prescriptions, but not just those, young people's bus travel. And more generally, transport services are much more subsidised in Scotland than they are in the rest of the UK. And that's not just about sort of the geography. Now, the main beneficiaries of this universalist approach compared to a means-tested approach are middle and upper income families. But if you look at the other side, the tax and benefits, whilst there's a more universalist approach to public services and benefits in kind, there's a more redistributive sort of approach on tax and benefits. As Emma was saying earlier, there's quite big increases in income tax on higher earners, there's been some more modest, much more modest changes to council tax. There's also the Scottish Char payment and a range of other benefits changes as well. Now, the overall effect of all these is to make it, quite more progressive on the tax and benefit side, particularly for families with children. So I think there's this model of a state that does more for everyone in terms of public services and does more redistribution in terms of tax and benefits. And that is something that I think is signed up pretty much across the board to varying extents. The Conservatives in Scotland less so than, say, the SNP and Labour, but in the last election, 2021, even the Conservative manifesto was pushing further in this direction. Now, it's not clear to me that this model will survive a likely future funding squeeze. I said it's been about 25 to 30% extra funding in Scotland compared to the rest of, or compared to England for the last 25 years. The Barnett formula probably is now going to start squeezing Scotland. Now, the Scottish Government has hinted that as this happens, it will take, there's three choices it could take, really. One is it could try to salami slice each service. Two, it could put up taxes further. Or three, it could try to hone in and maybe make some of its more universal policies more targeted. What's called the MTFS, Medium-Term Fiscal Strategy, suggests maybe some of all of these, but it could be a bit of a move away from a universalist approach with lots of references to targeted spending in the MTFS. Now, how does this relate to economic policy? Well, I don't think the economy has been the driving force behind this sort of Scottish model of the state. I think one simple factor is money. In the 1990s, well, the 2000s and the 2010s, the Scottish Government had more money to spend. At that stage, it didn't have benefits policy, it didn't have tax policy. What can it do? It can spend more on public services. But I think it's not just more money. I think it also sort of reflects a slightly broader view of citizens' rights and the role of the state than in the rest of the UK. Something sort of akin to specific egalitarianism, as economists call it. So basically the idea that certain services should be available for all citizens, irrespective of the ability to pay. And I think clearly a big motivation of the more recent tax and benefit changes has been the sort of focus on child poverty in particular, but inequality more generally. So whilst I think this is not really about economic policy, I think it does relate to economic policy. Because I think the Scottish Government sees this model as a different, or part of a different approach to growing the economy and making Scotland an attractive place for people to live. And Emma mentioned this as well. So we saw last week new HMRC analysis, which on its own suggested there was a bit of a response in migration when Scotland first introduced its income tax policies. But there was a separate paper in there which showed that both in Scotland and Wales, there's been growing net migration, including of higher earners, into these countries. Now, how that relates to policy is really uncertain. It looks like it's a kind of common factor affecting certainly Scotland and Wales, and it does seem to kind of line up with the timing of the pandemic. But in its response, the Scottish Government, it focused on the idea that, well, look, we shouldn't focus too much on tax and how that's affecting people. We should look at these overall trends and look at this, how this relates to our public service offers, that we have a better place to live if you're middle or higher income because you get free prescriptions, you get free tuition, you get these free services. So I think the Scottish Government is rather trying to adapt a different economic policy through its public service offering. So rather than seeing low taxes as sort of the route to attracting people and to sort of grow the supply side of the economy, it is seeing public services and the offering of greater investment as a sort of key competitive advantage. Now, I don't think we'll ever know with any real confidence whether this is more effective than the tax policy, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. I think there are increasingly big changes in certain areas of policy. I think tax and benefit policy is one that was mentioned already. And I think education spending and policy is another one where in recent years, Scottish performance has been pretty poor. This big boost in spending might start to feed through to results. If it does, that's something that we should know about. So I think, whilst we'll never know for sure, actually understanding more about the changes in tax and benefit policy and education spending and policy should be really important focuses for sort of future analysis of Scotland's policy mix. And with that, I'll end.
Here, let me take that one. That's okay. Thank you very much, David, and I'm very impressed that there were no slides and yet lots of figures. So great presentation. I'll now hand over to Professor Katie Hayward.
Thank you very much, Clodagh. Good morning, everybody. Thanks to Policywise and Resolution Foundation for the invitation. It's a great honour to be representing Northern Ireland alongside Clodagh. As Clodagh mentioned, I've done a lot of work that's very interdisciplinary, but one thing I can't fake is being an economist, let alone an expert on public spending. So I won't do that. But what I will do is set the context for Northern Ireland and in particular diagnose the core of the problem. A quarter of a century ago, the conditions in which devolution was restored to Northern Ireland, bearing in mind it had its own government for 50 years before direct rule was imposed in 72, were not the ones from which anyone would have chosen to build an economy. 30 years of violent conflict had left their mark in terms of infrastructure investment and labour force, let alone in the legacy in the health service and public services, including policing, of course. Nevertheless, there was an optimism with the 98 Good Friday Belfast Agreement and a determination for normality. When the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey asked people in 98 what the new Assembly should prioritise, the answers were overwhelmingly clear: the health service and the economy. Constitutional matters, even those of rights and equalities, were lower down the list. 25 years on, we asked the same questions, and the answers remain the same: health and the cost of living. We also posed the question to 16-year-olds. What would make Northern Ireland a good place to live? Their top answers were probably the same as any young person in the UK or Ireland: low cost of living, strong economy, and a good job. Second in the priority list, support services for mental health and well-being. This was placed even more highly than a stable political system and peace process. So it's particularly to our shame that Northern Ireland is not delivering on any of these priorities, no more for this generation than the ones who endured the Troubles. Why is this the case? The simple answer is that devolution in Northern Ireland has not been established or designed to run as if to address those priorities. The focus at the start was addressing a core dysfunction, namely its awkward, contested existence, and we've not got much further beyond that. This is not to say there haven't been brilliant entrepreneurs, smart civil servants, or responsible politicians, but there are structural and habitual problems that have remained unaddressed. Indeed, these flaws have been exacerbated, not abated, by the management of devolution by both Westminster and Stormont. Northern Ireland is governed on a very different basis to the rest of the UK, namely, fundamentally, the notion that it's lucky to have a government at all, and that this government stands or falls on the recognition of identity, not on the exercise of democratic responsibility. The larger parties are guaranteed a place in the executive. In this sense, measurements of performance of MLAs are valid primarily as performance of identity stances rather than as policymakers or decision makers. What is worse, however, and this is the core of my argument, is that the UK government has incentivised and rewarded identity performances. I'll come back to this. And so unsurprisingly, Northern Ireland is in a poor condition. To be precise, as the Independent Fiscal Commission put it in 22, Northern Ireland is significantly poorer than the UK as a whole. National income per head is about 25% lower than that of the UK, and even lower when compared to the Republic of Ireland, which is a valid comparison to make. Northern Ireland's in the bottom 3 UK regions for weekly median earnings, consistently the bottom region in the UK on economic activity, and in the bottom 2 with the North East on employment rate. Tax revenues per person are 25% lower, and the executive has decided to forego substantial amounts of revenue had it matched policy in other parts of the UK. Meanwhile, public spending is about 20% higher on a per person basis than spending in the UK as a whole. 90% of public spending is from the block grant of 14.8 million. So there's a very large notional fiscal deficit and one that's set to grow. And the problems are growing as well. To get an impression of these, just take a look at the headlines of recent reports of the Audit Office of Northern Ireland. On water infrastructure, a lack of capacity has meant development of applications in 100 areas can't be approved or are subject to restrictions. On water quality, less than a third of Northern Ireland's rivers had good ecological status. Only 14% of its lakes have good ecological status, which is down from 24% in 2015. On waiting lists, infamously, the total numbers waiting either for an initial outpatient appointment, inpatient treatment, or a diagnostic test have risen by 185% since 2014. So it's now 0.7 million patients on a list out of a population of 1.9 million. and on child poverty, around 1 in 5 children in Northern Ireland are living in relative poverty, with little sustained reduction in levels over the last 8 years. Notably, when an Opposition Day motion was put forward by the SDLP in the Assembly earlier this month to address the impact of the two-child limit on universal credit, it was watered down by the executive parties, who took pains to say it was a UK government policy they didn't agree with, and that the UK government hadn't given them enough money to address it. But of course, when problems aren't being addressed, they're actively getting worse and compounding, and contributing to further difficulties, particularly for the younger generation. Northern Ireland's devolved institutions haven't functioned properly for 40% of the past quarter century, and for its part, the UK government has used Northern Ireland's crippled economic conditions in ways more akin to moral blackmail than democratic care. For example, when civil servants were given powers to govern Northern Ireland in the absence of an executive and assembly as a result of the recent DUP veto, they were charged with making severe budget cuts. Jane Brady, as head of the civil service, made the unprecedented step of speaking publicly about the long-term harm being caused. The answer came back, if you want to fix it, tell your politicians to get back into government. Sure enough, when the Safeguarding the Union deal was made earlier this year, to persuade the DUP back into power sharing, it came along with a big whack of money, 3.3 billion, on top of the block grant. A similar situation occurred a few years ago when the DUP secured money from the government in exchange for its confidence and supply arrangement with May's Conservative Party. Though to be fair, this was probably the best thing to come out of that particular deal. What this shows is that the budget for Northern Ireland was inadequate, and we know it. But the additions are made on the basis of political expediency and incentivising that identity performance. Northern Ireland has no dearth of opportunities. It has a wealth of potential and proposals, including from the aforementioned Fiscal Commission, which recommends some fiscal devolution as a means of encouraging more accountable government. But evidence since the most recent restoration of the executive indicates that neither the UK government nor the executive think enough of Northern Ireland to do anything other than blame each other for the current poor state of affairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And now I'll hand over to Jonathan Tench.
Thank you. I can see the former First Minister of Wales has arrived just in time for me to be the warmer pack in terms of what Wales is doing around well-being. So what I wanted to talk to you about is three things really, just to spell out the Well-being of Future Generations Act in Wales as a way that Wales is trying to do things differently, to talk a little bit about its impact, and then talk about some of the challenges and opportunities going forward. We've had lots of Welsh language lessons already today, so future generations in Welsh is Cenedlaethau'r Dyfodol, so that's my contribution, and I'm sure Mark will continue the lessons. So just on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, so this is a landmark piece of legislation that came in 2015. Wales became the first country to put the UN Sustainable Development Goals into law. And coupled with a large public consultation kind of exercise, Wales established 7 well-being goals that would be at the forefront of how we make policies in Wales. So we have a goal around a prosperous Wales, which does not include GDP growth, goals around a resilience Wales, around how we enhance nature, a healthier Wales, a more equal Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, a thriving Welsh language and culture, and a globally responsible Wales. These 7 wellbeing goals have been put into law, so there's a legal duty on Welsh ministers and the entire public sector system in Wales to work towards these wellbeing goals. They're backed up by 50 wellbeing indicators, which again does not include GDP growth, as a way of looking at, well, how are we really doing and making progress as a country that isn't about economic growth, but is about the well-being of people and planet. The duties on the public sector in Wales are some that in Scotland there is legislation looking at how they can adopt this legal duty on public bodies to develop well-being plans. And we have a collective duty around our well-being plans in Wales as well. So a local authority will develop its well-being proposals, so its plan on how to work towards
these 7 national wellbeing goals, but we'll also do that in a collective manner as well. So we'll work with the health bodies, the fire authorities, and others in terms of developing their wellbeing plans. And then we have an accountability role that the legislation has set up as well. So I work for Derek Walker, the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and our role is to promote the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and to hold Wales to account for how we're doing. So moving on then to the impact of the legislation. It's really become a key cornerstone of how policy is being made in Wales. So if you have a look at the Welsh Government's economic mission, if you have a look at the National Development Plan for Wales, its spatial plan, if you have a look at its latest Agriculture Act, the first Agriculture Act for Wales passed last year, you can see that the 7 wellbeing goals are at the heart of how Wales is building its policies. Just a quick snapshot of how we're doing in terms of these 50 national wellbeing indicators. Biodiversity is a huge challenge. We have seen a huge decline in that over many decades. That decline is stabilising slightly, but we are still, like the rest of the UK, extremely nature depleted, and there are lots of efforts by Welsh Government and others to address that and look at how we can protect and enhance nature. We measure the real living wage. We're at 68% in Wales. It's hovered at around that level for a number of years. We're an SME economy, which is many of the reasons why we're not making as much progress there maybe as other parts of the UK. Things that are going really well, the recycling rate in Wales. So we're the 3rd best recyclers in the world, behind only Germany and South Korea, and there's been a real effort at bringing together local and national efforts around recycling, and there's a huge focus on a circular economy in Wales as well. It's fair to say that the pandemic and the cost of living crisis has proved hugely challenging in terms of household income and poverty levels in the UK. One area that I wanted to just mention in terms of the impact of this legislation is around transport policy. What you can really see there is this shift in terms of making a transport policy work for future generations. So before the legislation, around 2/3 of capital spending on transport was for roads, for car users, and now it's only 1/3. And what you've seen is this huge investment in public transport as a result of that. If you're looking for a rail project that has gone very well in the UK, look at the South Wales Metro, which has had £1 billion of investment. But it's fantastic that Mark Drakeford is here as well. So he took a huge decision in 2019 around the extension of the M4 motorway in Wales. So if you're looking at, is this country serious about doing things differently? That M4 relief road, of course, the business lobby wanted it to go ahead. But the decision was made that the environmental, the health, the social consequences of extending the M4 motorway did not outweigh the, or did outweigh the economic benefits. And so this justification was put forward not to move ahead with that policy because of the impact on future generations. Just in terms of some of the challenges and opportunities moving forward, this is a huge new way of doing things to get everyone to work together around 7 wellbeing goals. Change is really hard, and that culture and that leadership shift is very challenging, particularly down at the local level. We've had 10 years now of this legislation, but we've had decades of just pursuing economic growth at all costs in the past. So this change is taking time. It's fair to say that there's a lot of public opposition as well, which is hugely challenging for our policymakers as they develop ambitious policies for what to do. What Wales is trying to do in terms of farming subsidies, I think, is far more ambitious than many of the parts of the UK, and that's caused huge challenges in terms of convincing farmers to look at how they can protect and enhance nature as a result of farm payments. But there's some a scope, I think, for some resolution there. Even the farmers' unions in Wales are agreeing that we need to take action around climate change. And 20 miles per hour has been hugely challenging as well. So these are real kind of challenges, but what you can see in Wales as a result of this legislation and lots of political leadership is that Wales is really pushing ahead and trying to really shift things. I just want to talk quickly about some of the opportunities. I read recently in The Economist, they came down to Wales, which was nice of them to do, and they talked about how Welsh policymakers are more interested in copying what's going on in Venezuela than England. I have to say nothing could be further from the truth. There's a huge amount that Wales is learning from what's going on in the rest of England, devolved bits, but also local authorities. Just as an example, we've been learning a lot from the Preston model around the foundational economy. So since 2018, Welsh Government has been pursuing that as a key plank of its economic policy. It's often called the everyday economy. Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have been using that term, maybe less so in the last couple of years. But it's about how do you keep the local pound spent locally. And I think there's a huge amount as well that Wales can learn from not only what Preston has been doing around kind of localising procurement spend, but Preston has also been looking at the types of businesses to invest in. So how do you invest in social enterprise with your public contracts? And then looking at the kind of finance models that are needed. And so there's a huge amount that I think Wales can learn from that. In Scotland, they call foundational economy community wealth building, and they're consulting on legislation around that, which is about putting a requirement on public bodies to spend locally. So there's a huge amount to learn. Wales and Scotland are part of the Wellbeing Government Alliance that are looking at how do we move beyond GDP growth. So I think a key part of the opportunities is learning from other devolved administrations around well-being. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Great, so now we've got plenty of time for some questions. David, I'm going to kick off with you first because something that struck me whenever you were talking about potential options against a challenging public spending picture was this idea of salami slicing across the board, which is something that is certainly happening in Northern Ireland, as you heard Katie mentioning a few of our areas which have been facing really troubling headlines. Could you argue, and yes, I'm going to tie back into the previous panel on taxes and benefits, but there's an obvious overlap there. Is that inevitable unless there are more difficult political decisions taken, unless there is more political leadership?
Is my microphone working yet?
No. I can give you this one here.
Okay.
You can take that down with you.
Great. So is it inevitable that you have a salami slicing? I don't think it's inevitable, but I think...
In the absence of further action?
Well, in the absence of further action, yes. So that's by the action of what's called the Barnett Formula, which is underlying the funding for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I said over the last 25 years, due to a combination of factors, actually, one of the kind of key features of the Barnett Formula hasn't operated. And that key feature of the Barnett Formula is called the Barnett Squeeze. Because what the Barnett Formula does is it takes the funding you have in the last year and adds on the amount equivalent to the population share of the funding change in England. So if you start off with a higher than population funding share, over time, the funding formula should sort of bring you down towards the English levels. Now, that hasn't happened in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, really, until very recently in the case of Northern Ireland, for several factors. But unless those factors are repeated, that squeeze starts to operate. So at the moment, I said Scotland gets about 25% more per person to spend. In the next 15 to 20 years, that could fall to about 15% more per person to spend, which is still more, but is a much smaller gap. And that's why I think, you would need to have that sort of difficult decisions made. Either you need to kind of like cut back service provision. If you kind of try to salami slice, you see sort of a slow degradation across services. Or we need to prioritise. And one way to prioritise, and I said this is what's in the MTFS. It says, with more difficult fiscal environment ahead, we need to think about more targeted approaches. Is that the Scottish Government signalling that some of these more universalist sort of type things, they're being thought about? Last but not least is tax. And we've already seen tax increases in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK. I think the rest of the UK will be putting up taxes in the future. You asked that in the last panel, or it was one of the questions, should England be putting up taxes? I think there's a question about the size of the state, what you think. But again, unless you do just kind of, cut back on kind of a range of services, taxes are heading one way, heading up. But in Scotland, I think they'd need to head up even more, given that Barnett squeeze, unless you make some difficult decisions, whether that is just to kind of cut back across the board or to focus the resources on on sort of those objectives that the Scottish Government's highlighted, so sustainability, poverty reduction, and so on. And I think the ones that you'd be looking at naturally, if you're looking at poverty reduction, would be shifting funding on education from sort of upper ages, higher education, more down towards lower ages. And we've already seen a bit of that happening in Scotland with big increases in funding for childcare and a squeeze on resources for teaching in universities. But the next question is, does free higher education survive for the next 20 years in Scotland?
We've had a question here for Katie. Katie, what would you propose for taking the focus off the Constitution and shifting it towards things like health and jobs? I know you mentioned that in your presentation that you could argue that the decisions that have been taken in Northern Ireland maybe aren't being made for the right reasons.
Yes, so I think the report of the Independent Fiscal Commission from 22 was very serious and probably the most substantial set of proposals we have for moving towards more normal, accountable government. So devolving some, you mentioned it earlier as well, some responsibilities with respect to income tax, maybe following the Scottish model, potentially, possibly, if not that far, then the Welsh model, and then devolving corporation tax has been promised, but actually hasn't been done yet, and other areas of responsibility. I think, if I'd be really honest with you, I think all of this should come together. I can't see us moving towards that yet. And I think all this should come together with a so-called revision of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, which the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee in Westminster has recommended, although the DUP had its alternative minority report to that. And we know, obviously, the DUP and Sinn Féin would be very resistant to a significant overhaul. But I think all of this comes together. So 25 years on, we are in a different place. We do have a different generation. A third of our population have been born post-Good Friday Belfast Agreement. And I think there's a very severe risk of things getting considerably worse with an entrenchment of strong unionism and rising expectations of Irish unification. As we've been reminded recently with a recent slightly controversial paper from two economists in Dublin, the cost of unification will be very much in the mix, and this is becoming a murky debate. And I think the reassessment of Northern Ireland, qua Northern Ireland as an entity, needs to take place altogether. So some, possibly maybe even with a referendum on reform of the agreement, what we want from our functioning institutions for the next 10 years, let's just put it that way. And then with that, bring some of those reforms that the Fiscal Commission recommended. Set a kind of transition period, if you like, although you probably couldn't call it that.
Not another transition period, Kitty.
But that would be, I think, like, if we're serious, like, Ireland doesn't want a basket case, the UK doesn't need a basket case, Northern Ireland needs some serious reform, politically and economically, and I think putting those two together could actually be the best way of managing it.
We've had another question here. How much scope does devolution provide for a different economic strategy versus tinkering with a UK-wide one? Jonathan, have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I think definitely economic policy is being viewed differently in Wales as a result of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So calling into question, is it all about economic growth that we're trying to do, or actually is it about economic growth serving well-being of people and planet? So definitely economic policy is being viewed very differently. When I look at the growth mantra of what happens around UK economic debates, in Wales you see conversations about growth for kind of future generations, and in fact the two leadership manifestos to be for the race to become the new First Minister in Wales, there actually wasn't much between them at all in terms of looking at economic growth to serve sustainable development. So definitely a clear sort of new angle being taken in Wales around economic development policy. I do see, though, the tension of, in Welsh economic development thinking, you've got on the one hand this push for foundational economy and circular economy, particularly with circular economy, let's produce and consume less things. But then on the other hand, you've also got, a business strategy around innovation and kind of growing new companies. And so I think it's very interesting that we have that tension there between the traditional and the new way of kind of thinking. And probably that's the way it has to be, is you sort of try and shift from a GDP growth model, at all costs towards a new way of thinking about the economy. So that tension is quite interesting to me in terms of how that will develop over time.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but look at this with my Northern Irish hat on, and one of the stats that Katie had mentioned, which is always quite stark, is that 90% of our funding for public services comes from the block grant. So really, and again, it ties into our previous panel. When your kind of fiscal levers are so limited, surely it really only is ever tinkering around the edges. In terms of the restrictions that maybe the executive, for example, would have when it comes to trying to come up with its own economic strategy, it probably, you could argue, some may argue it would need more powers in order to do that, to make a difference.
Yeah, so but again, you come back to the tension between the political and the economic. So you saw this in the Safeguarding the Union deal, which is about Northern Ireland's post-Brexit position, which shows the limits of a UK-wide strategy, right? Northern Ireland's position is so distinctly different now. But the potential opportunities from that distinct position were, in some ways, disparaged, if not undermined, by that Safeguarding the Union deal. So instead of, corporation tax is there as something that unionists even recognise Northern Ireland should be better aligned with the Republic of Ireland on, but downplaying the all-Ireland economy and cross-border trade, which is the only thing that's growing, is just a real pity.
Yeah.
And there's lots of opportunities in that Safeguarding the Union deal with regards to all UK internal market and all UK-wide economic development, but Wales and Scotland aren't written into that. So that East-West Council, for the moment, it seems, is Northern Ireland and Westminster. So I think fundamentally we need a new approach a more respectful approach to devolution itself, in order to allow the necessary flexibilities and opportunities to be grasped by the various parts of the UK to be realised.
Yeah.
I might come in as well. So I think, reflecting on what Emma said earlier, it is important to recognise that many levers are held at the UK government level, but actually we think that for the long term, what matters more for the economy is not a sort of, macroeconomic framework matters, but it's not sort of the demand side, it's the supply side of the economy. And many of the kind of key levers on the supply side do vest with the devolved governments as it stands. So productivity, one of the key drivers of that is skills and education. And skills and education have been devolved since 1999 to Wales and Northern Ireland. So I think it's important to kind of actually look at, what impacts are devolved policies having on skills. So in Scotland, actually quite a disappointing kind of story during the kind of 2010s when it came to sort of school standards. Has this kind of big injection of money from about 2016 onwards, is that starting to kind of feed through and lead into better results? Quite different higher education policy choices in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK and, say, Wales. So in Scotland, the way the kind of higher education system works is it's quite a strong encouragement to stay in Scotland. You have free tuition. If you stay in Scotland, you don't if you go in the rest of the UK. How does that affect where people end up? Does that have an impact on the economy? You've got planning and, say, land use, where not only is local taxation, but also planning policy is devolved. And we know that the UK has some of the sort of biggest constraints on development. Some colleagues have been recently looking at what's called the elasticity of supply of housing from changes in prices. For every kind of percent change in house prices, in the UK, housing supply responds less than half as much as in the US. That's an area where that's under devolved government. So I think we need to recognise that there are a lot of powers are still centralised, and of course devolved governments have a right to say, look, this is holding us back. If we had more powers in this area, it could help us. But actually also focus on the areas where they do have powers, where certainly on land and land taxation, I'd say they've been timid. On education, I think the jury's out on whether some of the most recent changes are going to be beneficial. But certainly in the 2010s, the direction was very much in the wrong direction when it came to outcomes, at least, where both Scotland and Wales are increasingly falling behind England.
We've had a question for you, David. It says, the debate last week was about the impact of increased defence spending on other public services. Could David expand on what it could mean for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland? How protected are they?
Well, it sort of depends on what the UK government would do in the next spending review. So the current government, when it announced this 2.5% of GDP target for defence, didn't announce any further changes in the overall spending envelopes. And the overall spending envelope is a 1% increase per year in funding public services in the next Parliament. Now, when you take account of plans for health, when you take account of childcare reforms, and you take account of now defence, what that could mean for unprotected services is about 3 to 4% per person per year cuts in funding. Now, translate this all into what it means for Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. It looks like it could mean increases for those countries of about 1% a year in the overall funding from the UK government. That's because they get a kind of combination of the changes for the various departments through the Barnett formula. So with health going up a lot, they get money from that. Other areas being cut back, that cuts back. But with an overall envelope fixed, more money for something that's not at all devolved, defence, means less for things that are. So that would negatively impact the funding for Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. I think the real question is, what will the next government do to public service spending? I think this sort of 1% limit that's been penciled in currently, I wouldn't treat that with any real confidence. I think what you've seen with spending reviews over the last kind of 10 years or so is that when governments are forced to make the tough decisions about not just sort of hypothetical cuts to some services, but real cuts to some services, they tend to find some additional money to top it up. Will they find much money to top it up? I don't think that much. I think it will be difficult. But I think until the next election, till after the election, we won't have a clear idea about exactly how much money is available for services in England, let alone Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
Yeah, we've had a question for Jonathan. Could Wales make the real voluntary living wage a legal minimum wage? And would that be desirable if it was possible within the devolved powers?
It's probably a question for the Resolution Foundation. I would just say what I said earlier around the progress of the real living wage. I haven't looked at this in detail, but my sense is, with us being an SME economy, this is one of the challenges that we're facing around that. Something I think that is very interesting, I know I'm meant to be talking about Wales, and I've talked about Preston quite a lot, but what I really like about what Preston have done is not just looking at how do we keep spend local, but they've been looking at how to do a real campaign around the real living wage there. And what I'm really interested in Wales is whether we can really look at, around our local authorities and our regional economic strategies, how can we both be promoting kind of spending within Wales, but also looking at making sure that in all of these kind of contracts that we've got the real living wage kind of, at the centre of what kind of good local economic strategies would be. So I'm not quite answering the question, but I'm sure Resolution Foundation can help on that.
We've actually had a couple of Welsh-specific questions, which I'll stick with you. Is there any evidence that the Welsh Wellbeing Act has increased the rate at which wellbeing grows?
Yeah, I would say that transport example, to me, is the clearest example of a policy area being fundamentally transformed and turned on its head. And the justification used by Welsh ministers around changes in the way that we do transport, shifting out of cars to public transport, has been entirely about future generations. So when you go and have a look at the Senedd debates around these policy issues, you can see we're doing this for future generations at the heart of those debates. So we have these 50 wellbeing indicators that help us measure how we're doing. They get reported on every year. It's a pretty mixed bag in terms of how we're doing. So it's that, as I mentioned, household income, poverty levels have been really hit by the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, but you can also see some real concerted action and some bright spots around kind of recycling, around some other areas as well. So, we're 10 years into this legislation. That's against decades of doing things the other way. So a bit like devolution, there's obviously a bit more kind of ground to go around looking at these real improvements for kind of people's well-being. Has the legislation made everything okay in Wales? No, But do we have a serious plan about meeting the needs of current and future generations and making that the Welsh national mission? Yes. So I've got a lot of hope in what we can do in future.
Thank you. We've got a question here that I'll put to each of you about the respective regions. So it says, in Denmark, people are mostly happy to pay high taxes because they benefit from excellent universal public services. In England, more and more people want taxes to go up to prevent public services from falling off a cliff. Are public attitudes in the three devolved nations closer to Denmark or England? Katie, I mean, whenever unfortunately in Northern Ireland, we're a little bit numb to seeing these really bleak headlines. We know our waiting lists are the worst. We know our water quality is, appalling. But similarly, what would your take be on this?
So I'm going to share some information that shouldn't be divulged anywhere else.
It'll stay with us and the people watching online at home.
No, well, in the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, I'm involved in setting the political attitudes modules. And we always ask the same questions, obviously, to allow the time series, but we get a chance to ask a couple of different questions every year. And this past one, we asked basically sort of left-right questions, because we wanted to measure Northern Ireland on a similar basis to the way that other people in the rest of the UK get measured. And on this question in relation to public spending, and we're not releasing the results officially until May, but they do, they are more left wing, like they would like to pay higher taxes and see for the benefit of public services. On other matters, though, possibly unsurprisingly, they're more conservative, but on this, they would generally be towards the Denmark side.
David, what about Scotland?
So I should first say I'm not an expert on public opinion, but the one thing I do know is that traditionally the kind of finding was that if you asked people on sort of attitudes and sort of social attitude surveys, attitudes about the size of the state, the role of the state, Scotland and England actually didn't differ all that much historically. Scottish politics tended to kind of tend towards a bit more of the left. Although that's only really since kind of the 1960s. Look back to the 50s, Scotland was sort of actually slightly more to the, Conservatives did very well in the 1950s in Scotland. But, say from the 60s onwards through to the 90s, it was kind of politics to the left. But on social attitudes, Scotland looked fairly similar to the sort of English levels. Now, more recently, you do see Scottish politics, and that's moved probably further to the left, but also Scottish social attitude surveys now, that does start to see a bit of a sort of change, and Scottish attitudes now do seem to be the left, actually not only of England, but also Wales, interestingly, on kind of issues relating to the role of the state. And it's very scientific, but my kind of own thought about this is I think that this is an instance where it's not been a bottom-up driven change, but a top-down driven change, in partly, and it relates to identity, come back to the point you were making, I think alongside the independence referendum, there's been a sort of shift in idea of what it means to be Scottish. And I think that a lot of people kind of associate Scottishness now with a slightly more progressive sort of approach to the role of the state. So I think that there has been a change in the, say, last 10 years in particular that has come from sort of elite attitudes kind of filtering down, and also kind of views about the role of the state becoming equated to sort of more fundamental views about basically identity and independence.
And Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm not on top of the polling data in Wales. We do have income tax powers in Wales. Those have not been used by Welsh government. One of the things that we track through the Future Generations Act, though, is do you feel like you have a say in your community, in how decisions are made in Wales? That's at 30%, which is low, but it has increased remarkably over from a very low base, decades ago. So we are seeing sort of people feel a lot more kind of involved in decision making, which is a very positive thing. But I'll leave the tax varying answer to others.
And we've also been asked another Welsh question. Does the presence of things like the third sector scheme in Wales support closer relations with civil society organisations that support delivery against the social, economic and environmental priorities of devolved administrations? And should the UK government look to introduce something similar?
Yeah, and again, I don't want to steal the thunder of Mark Drakeford kind of on this, but new legislation has come in Wales around social partnership. And so placing the importance of involving trade unions, businesses and the third sector at the heart of decision making. When you listen to Welsh ministers talk about their policy agendas, it's this Team Wales approach that you always kind of see. And I think a lot of that is supported by this sense of these are our 7 national goals. This is the mission that we're behind. And that really brings in a sense of greater collaboration. One thing that I didn't mention yet is the private sector in Wales is not beholden to the Future Generations Act, but they're taking action on it. So I'm seeing Welsh businesses align their corporate strategies to the wellbeing goals. What they say to me is, now that the public sector and the third sector have got their goals that they want, it's a lot easier for me as a business to come in behind it. So that sense of collaboration, I think, is greatly supported by having this sense of a national mission with the wellbeing goals. Thanks.
Great. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. We'll have to leave it there. But a big round of applause and a huge thank you to each of our panellists, to Katie, Jonathan and David. And I'll now hand back to Torsten for our next keynote. Thank you very much.
Great, we're nearly there. Lunch beckons, for those of you looking famished in the room. Before we move on to our next panel, can we all just thank Clodagh Rice for that brilliant, taking us through the last 2.5 hours? It's very good of her. Just feel next time you're feeling kind of, oh, that journalist didn't say what I wanted them to say, just remember what she said to you about trying to explain the fiscal framework in 30 seconds. Unless you're doing the job, guys, you can't judge. Which brings me, so we heard from John earlier a great reflection on 25 years of devolution and what that's meant for politics and for policy making. It's quite a hard act to follow, but we've got the one other person in who've lived experience of running a devolved administration who can do so. So next we're going to hear from Mark Drakeford, who was First Minister of Wales between 2018 and 2024, and before that was lucky enough to be the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. So obviously the Resolution Foundation are keen at this point. He did the economic side of things too, but even more exciting, what's better than public services and economic policy, but someone who also had an experience before that as an academic working as a professor of social policy and social science. This is basically what dreams look like in Resolution Foundation land. And actually, I'm semi-joking, but there aren't many politicians most politicians faced with kind of people like us with charts, and not all, any of you watching, not you, obviously, don't tend to say when they disagree. And one of the great things about Mark is when he disagrees with you, politely obviously, he tells you, and then even better, he tells you why, because he's actually thought about it. So Wales has been very lucky to have him. I've always benefited from hearing from him. So Mark's going to give us his reflections on the devolution experience, and then we're going to open up for questions as we did before. So Mark, over to you.
Wel, Torsten, diolch yn fawr am y wahoddiad unwaith eto I siarad gyda'r Foundation. Thank you very much once again for the chance to be with the Resolution Foundation. I'm planning on only doing 2 things. As ever, you sit and listen to others and feel I could have torn all this up and written something completely different about other interesting aspects of that devolution journey. But for today, just 2 aspects for me. I'm going to say something about the history of devolution, about the constitutional settlement, about where we are today in the future of the United Kingdom and small things like that. And underneath that big blanket, I am going to focus a bit more on the economy, the history of the economy over the last 25 years, the things that have gone reasonably well, the things that are clearly still to do, and so on. So I'm going to start with a bigger picture. So 25 years ago exactly to today, some of us were out there on the mean streets of Cardiff bothering people in their own homes, as politicians have to do, because the election was just a few days away. And the background to that first election in Wales was so different to the background in Scotland that I thought I ought to just start with that, because the Scottish experience was of a huge campaign, a convention, the involvement of civic society, and huge public enthusiasm for devolution. The position in Wales was very different. We scraped through the referendum in the middle of the night when Carmarthen, my own home county, I'm pleased to say, voted in favour of devolution. And that hesitant start, that uncertain, hesitant start, was very much the shaping experience of those early days. Apologies to those of you who I've told this story before, but it seems to me to illustrate something. A good friend in the very early days of devolution was Professor Scott Greer, who was a Canadian researcher in Canada these days, in the UK at the time, and Scott's area was health policy, and he used to tell a story of delivering a lecture. He delivered the same lecture on Monday night in Edinburgh, and he delivered the identical lecture in Cardiff on the following evening. And the title of the lecture was to do with public health. Public health, Scotland is good, but Wales is better. And what he used to say was, he wasn't believed in either place. Okay? The Scottish audience couldn't believe that they were not in first place, and the Welsh audience couldn't believe that they were in first place. And that just tells you something, I think, about that hesitant, very early days. And the history, really, and probably the most remarkable thing about Welsh devolution, is how an institution that was very narrowly supported, had an incredibly difficult first year, has finally found itself in a position where it is a completely taken for granted part of the constitutional landscape in Wales. And not only is the institution taken for granted, but the model is taken for granted as well. I have been asked countless times, one of the least interesting questions that I'm asked is, isn't Wales indeed curious? And the reason it's not an interesting question is because it patently isn't true. And if you want to see the lived example of that, in our last elections, 3 years ago now, in 2021, the choice was absolutely explicitly in front of voters in Wales. You had an abolish the Assembly Party with all the advantages of a proportional system and led by people who'd been in the Senedd for the previous 5 years, what was left of the sort of UKIP, the UKIP surge. So 5 years of the platform that provides, the system that allows relatively minority views to have their expression in the Senedd, and not a single one of them was elected. At the other end of the spectrum, Plaid Cymru, which has slightly played fast and loose with independence over the years. Sometimes it's, we're big believers in, we probably believe in independence down here somewhere. In 2021, independence was front and centre of the Plaid Cymru campaign. Vote for us for an independent Wales. And Plaid Cymru had their worst result in any election since 1999. And the Labour Party, which continues to stand on the belief of strong and entrenched devolution in a successful United Kingdom, we had our best result in 20 years, despite the fact of having been in government for the whole of that period. So the remarkable question, I think, is not, is Wales interested in independence, but why, with all its imperfections and its hesitations, why does the Welsh public remain so attached to that original 99 model? And one of the reasons, I think, that it continues to command the support of people in Wales is because devolution has been a journey. Because the Senedd today is very different to the Senedd of 1999. I was lucky enough to arrive in the year 2000 and have been there more or less ever since. And it is literally true that in those early days, the Senedd would debate the smaller Egyptian potato order because there wasn't an awful lot else to talk about. Today, the Senedd is a primary lawmaking institution. It makes the laws for Wales in devolved areas. It has fiscal responsibilities alongside the other responsibilities that it exercises. It's a very different place, and I think the journey has been important in continuing to secure the support of people in Wales to that underpinning model. That model has been under the greatest strain since 2019. That is the fault line in Welsh politics. Scotland will be different in that way, but the real fault line in Welsh politics is the election for the first time in the history of devolution of a Conservative government in London with a considerable majority and a very different view of the United Kingdom, not simply to the Labour Party, but to other governments led by Conservative Prime Ministers. So my own assessment of this is that the constitutional future of the United Kingdom may be a suppressed crisis. It is not at the acute end that it was maybe only a couple of years ago, but there remains, I believe, a present danger to the continuation of the United Kingdom, and that the greatest risk to it is that hubristic feeling among some parts of the political spectrum that somehow this is a problem that's all over. It is certainly not. If it doesn't receive attention, then what is a suppressed crisis today has every opportunity to become a crisis on the surface of the United Kingdom in a relatively short order. And I'll return to a tiny bit of that at the very end. I said I was going to focus on issues to do with economics and the economic record. And that's, of course, because this is the Resolution Foundation, and the Foundation has been one of the very few voices which has been prepared to make the Welsh experience the focus of serious study. And the 2020 report that was produced by the Foundation on Welsh economic prospects and Welsh economic experience says itself that that experience has been too often overlooked by other analysts. I'm going to focus on the whole on some positives. I do that not because there are not very real challenges and areas where we would have wished to have done better, but I focus on the positives because you can be sure that the other aspects will always come up in any set of questions. So here are four, a modest set of them. And the first is to do with employment. If you lived in Wales in the 1990s, what you witnessed was a growing employment gap between Wales and the rest of the United Kingdom. It was a persistent gap, but it was a growing gap. The impact of the 1980s and the forced closures of large parts of heavy industry in Wales were absolutely still being felt in employment rates, and especially in levels of people outside the workplace altogether, economic inactivity. That gap has halved in the 20 years of devolution, and over significant periods of more recent years, the employment rate in Wales has been higher than the United Kingdom, the unemployment rate has been lower than across the United Kingdom, and the inroads into economic inactivity, setting aside for a moment, although it's got a big set aside, the impact of the pandemic and the more recent history, has, I think, well exceeded any expectations that people would have had at the start of devolution. If you'd said to people in 1999, within 20 years, you will have halved those gaps, not just, arrested the growing nature of the gap, but reversed it, I think people would have thought you were being very ambitious indeed. So my second point is about productivity, which, as we know, is the single biggest challenge facing the UK economy, and it's a very real challenge in parts of the Welsh economy, not in manufacturing, but in the service sector particularly. But despite the challenges, an analysis that PricewaterhouseCoopers produced just 6 months ago, concluded that over the last decade, 2011 to 2021, Wales had seen the highest productivity growth of any UK region or nation other than Northern Ireland. A 9.7% increase over that single decade. Now, productivity levels in large parts of the Welsh economy remain suppressed, below where they need to be. The struggle to improve them is not easy, but the picture is still of a level of improvement that's not been matched anywhere in Britain and has been exceeded only in Northern Ireland. I wanted to thirdly pick up some of the debates I could hear going on about GVA, GDP. Wales remains towards the bottom of the UK league table in both of those ways of measuring the economy. But there is a different story to be told if you look at figures for gross disposable income per household. So the actual money that actual people have in their pockets to spend. Here, the devolution period has seen a strong convergence between Wales and the United Kingdom. Median Welsh household income is around 4% lower than that of the United Kingdom as a whole. It was 7% at the start of devolution. And I'm going to say something in a minute about why money in the pockets of Welsh households doesn't reflect the wider gaps in GVA and GDP that you might have expected. Well, finally, I want to say something about equality. Now, you've heard already from Jonathan about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Of its 7 goals, surely the most radical and ambitious is that it has a goal for Wales to be a more equal country. And I remember very vividly the discussion in the cabinet when the goals were being signed off, because civil servants had produced a draft that committed Wales to having a goal of equality of opportunity. And it was, on the whole, a relatively rare discussion in cabinet, which was about politics and ideology and about the ambitions that you have as a political party. And that was the reason why the goal is not equality of opportunity. It is about equality of income. It is about wanting a society in which the gap between people who have to worry every single week about what they will eat and how they will pay for the most basic things, how the gap between people who have that experience can be narrowed between those people who have more than they will ever know what to do with. The Price Waterhouse Cooper report to which I referred said that Wales prioritises the fair distribution of income and wealth significantly more than any other region. Well, I'll forgive the word region for a minute, but the sentiment, I think, is an important one, and it's the Resolution Foundation work that shows that income inequality gaps in Wales are lower than across the United Kingdom as a whole, and that inequality gaps within Wales have narrowed, despite the headwinds created by a decade of austerity. And that narrowing is seen across the inequality gaps, the gaps in employment, in pay, in incomes, and in productivity. And those gaps have closed the most where the original gap was greatest. So I think on those tests as well, on the tests of employment, productivity, household disposable income, and equality, there is a positive case to be made for the economic experience of living in Wales over the last 25 years. I don't have time to do more than just to headline some of the reasons why I think that has been possible. I'm going to say a little bit more about one, because if there is a single story that unites every administration across that 25-year period in Wales, it is the pursuit of the social wage, as Barbara Castle would have said. Those things that we can do collectively, which if we do them collectively, leave more money in the pockets of our fellow citizens for them to decide what to do with for themselves. Or to use that wonderful term from the Beveridge report, to leave more money to fructify in the pockets of our fellow citizens. Now, what are the things that we have been able to do that rely on collective provision? That means that the citizen doesn't have to pay for those things themselves. Well, it's a long list. I'm only going to give you a few of them. A very early one was to introduce free travel on public transport for people aged over 60 and people with disabilities. The provision of free prescriptions was an early decision. It's been there now for over 20 years in Wales. There's no tax on income, or on illness rather, in that way. The expansion of education maintenance allowances, abolished in England, retained in Wales. The amount you get as a young person increased as well. The creation of a pupil deprivation grant, a grant to assist families with the cost of the school day. You know, we started it with just one school year. You got this help in the first year your child went to secondary school. Then we doubled it to 2 years, then we doubled it to 4 years, and now you get it every year. Every single year your child is of compulsory school age, you will get a sum of money from the Welsh Government to assist you with the fact that going to school is an expensive business. And if you've got nothing much to start with, a very expensive business indeed. We have in Wales retained both the council tax benefit and our version of the social fund. You know, the safety net of the last resort, where it is a national scheme, a rules-based scheme funded directly by the Welsh taxpayer. And just to give one example from the current Senedd term, of course we are still in the middle of a pilot of a universal basic income programme where every single care leaver in Wales over the period of the programme will receive a sum of money equivalent to the real living wage, unconditionally, as of right, to do what they like with, in the belief that those young people will make investment decisions that will put them on a track to a better future and avoid very expensive public expenditure dealing with the consequences of failure where we haven't been able to help those most vulnerable young people in our society. If you add all of that up, and some other things as well, then a not untypical Welsh household will have £2,000 in their pockets over a year that otherwise they would have to find for themselves. And that's one of the reasons why that disposable income per household issue is so important to us in Wales. None of those figures are taken into account in the figures I gave you earlier. The ONS doesn't recognise them as part of that calculation. But you put that in there as well, and the actual money you have to spend in Wales as a household, I think the gap between the UK level and the Welsh level is even narrower than I suggested to you earlier. Why else? What are the other things that have helped us on that journey? Well, without a doubt, the impact of European Union investment. The reason why the Welsh economy grew faster than the UK economy and grew even faster in Objective 1 areas was because of the way in which we were able to use that European Union investment. Investment in skills, David talked about that earlier. Qualification levels, skill qualification levels amongst the working age population in Wales has risen substantially in the decade beyond 2008. The underpinning impact of the social partnership approach, the Social Partnership Act that makes the social partnership model a statutory feature of life in Wales. Jonathan talked to you about the 51 well-being indicators that we have in Wales. We're the only part, I would guess, of the United Kingdom that has a growth in trade union membership as one of the positive indicators of well-being health. So, we positively want to encourage, we have the largest proportion of our workforce in trade unions already, and we think if we can get more people in there, that strengthens our social partnership model. The success of the Development Bank of Wales, outstandingly more successful than the British bank, although that is in much earlier days. And then the focus on the foundational economy that you heard about as well. Challenges remain as high as ever. Leaving the European Union has a particularly sharp impact on Wales because we have a higher proportion of our economy in manufacturing and in the agriculture sector, all now facing new barriers to trade and additional barriers practically every day. We have the impact of austerity and underinvestment. Demography is an issue for us in Wales. We have a higher part of our population that is aged over 65, over 75, over 85, and uniquely in the United Kingdom, we're a net importer of older people. People come to Wales when they're 65, and that has its challenges as well as the richness that they bring, and the continuing focus on, and in this way we are very aligned with the Resolution Foundation's recent work on the paradox of high inequality and low economic growth. And, I'm not here today at all to say that Wales doesn't display both of those features in a way that we would like to be able to do more. John Swinney, I know, and I was grateful to John for his sharing with me the script of what he was to say to you today, argues that it's impossible to divorce the economic record and the constitutional settlement, and I agree with that, but I don't follow the line that the SNP would then take in arguing that because the current settlement is unstable and vulnerable, that independence is the best way to find a new foundation for economic success in the future. I started by saying that the constitutional position within the United Kingdom remains one which is a crisis, albeit a suppressed crisis. What Wales needs and what the United Kingdom needs, if we are to continue to succeed together, is to be found in the roadmaps which are available to an incoming Labour government. It's there in the Brown report, it's there in the Constitutional Convention report that we commissioned in Wales, and that is entrenched devolution that can be defended against a rogue government of the sort that we have had since 2019, and which sees devolution not simply as a project for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, but has an English dimension to it as well, and makes that sense of a dispersed power, and I would argue a dispersed sovereignty that goes alongside it, a central rather than a peripheral way in which we organise both the United Kingdom and the economy that goes alongside it. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. That was predictably great. Thank you very much indeed for that. When we were talking to John earlier, and we started off with 25 years ago. So why don't we start there, given that you started there as well? And why was Wales such a reluctant devolver compared to I don't want to overdo, everybody in Scotland was enthusiastic, but definitely there'd been a strong build-up over 15 years beforehand. So why was Wales so different back then?
Well, my predecessor, Rodri Morgan, used to say when I couldn't stop him, I would try to stop him when I could.
Very honest of you.
He would say the problem was that in Wales we are pathologically modest. Now, he meant it both as a compliment.
Okay.
We are not of the sort of boosterism, breast-beating school of national identity. But sometimes that can topple over into a form of lack of self-belief in your ability to take control of your own affairs. And if you look at what was said by people who opposed devolution, not just in that referendum, but in subsequent referendum in 2010, the narrative was all about, oh, they'll never manage. Oh, they'll never be able to do it. Oh, they won't have any ideas. If they have any ideas, they won't be able to make them work. And even if they can make them work, they won't succeed in making any difference. It was all that sort of, irredeemably negative sense that people in Wales were somehow incapable of taking responsibility for their own futures and making a success of it. And if we had that referendum in 1997, which was very narrowly won, we had a further referendum in 2010, which was on taking primary lawmaking powers, and that was overwhelmingly passed. And I remember Rodri saying to me at the end of that, he said to me, well, my political task is done. In a decade, we have persuaded people in Wales that an institution about which they were very uncertain to get to a position where they think it is an institution that is not only central to everyday life, but where they wanted to have more responsibility for the way in which Wales is governed.
And what changed their mind over 10 years? And are they any longer pathologically humble?
What changed over the period, I think, is just the experience of it. The first year, as I said to you, was an incredibly difficult year. 3 of the 4 party leaders that started that year weren't there at the end of it.
High attrition. It's a song-like attrition rate.
Yes, indeed. And the Senate, the Assembly as it was, spent its whole time looking inwards and debating about how it itself was going to survive. What changed was the arrival of Rodri Morgan as the First Minister, the formation of a partnership government with the Liberal Democrats that gave a working majority to that first period, and remarkably, in the winter of the year 2000, a series of biblical-like plagues happened in Wales. And it became clear that already, when those things happened, when there was flooding, when there was a fuel crisis, when foot and mouth hit, I've forgotten the 4th F, the plague of frogs. There was something. Anyway, people looked to the Assembly as the place where they expected a response to that difficulty to be organised. And that's when the corner, I felt, was properly turned.
So, do you think it's changed Wales, as well as changing attitudes to the Assembly government?
Well, I think it has. I think the pandemic, which you may have talked about a bit, is a second big moment in all of that, when it becomes clear to people who actually hadn't realised for 20 years where some of the decisions that are now being made, that they were being made in Wales, and just the profile of the institution and its significance in people's lives became of a different sort of order.
Very good. Can we talk a bit about political culture? Because you said that there are lots of differences between the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish experience. But one of the things that makes Wales stand out is obviously that the same party has been running the show, admittedly in different forms, but has been running the show for 25 years. You reasonably were boasting about the recent result, which is surprising in some ways for an incumbent party over such a length of time. But how does that affect the political culture? And how do you feel like it's changed over those 25 years?
Well, I think we've learned 2 things, at least in 25 years.
Only 2?
Well, I mention them because I think they're things that have not been learnt at all at the UK level.
Okay.
The first is that a proportional election system is good for you. So without a proportional election system, Labour would have been in untrammelled power in Wales, with no sense at all amongst opposition parties that there was a chance that they may have an opportunity to share in that. That would have been very corrosive, I think, of political culture. And the fact that Labour's never actually won a majority. We have 30 seats at the moment out of 60. You can't pass a budget on 30 seats. You can't pass legislation on 30 seats. You've got to work with somebody else. So that's the second thing we've learnt, is that working with other parties is not a failure of democracy. Now, in London, it seems to me, there's a huge antipathy to proportional representation. People would rather lose power than share power, astonishingly, to me, here. And also, that if you do have to work with another party because, you know, a strange result throws that up, that is somehow a terrible aberration and a failure of politics. Whereas what I think we have learnt in Wales is both that proportional forms of representation, even when they send you people you'd rather not be seeing, actually that is a strength, and that the fact that you have to work across party boundaries to form an administration, that progressive parties are capable. It's not easy, it's very hard work, it takes hours and hours of talking and energy and so on, but in the end it allows you to do things at the progressive end of politics that otherwise you couldn't do. And you know, I think both of those lessons remain very unlearnt here, and I think we have learnt them both in Wales.
Great. Let's do a bit on relationships for the Welsh Government to the UK Government and to the other devolved administration. So one of the popular questions online, which will appear here, is just, now, we don't want to prejudge things. Politics is very unstable. We've learnt that in the last few hours. But assuming that the polls look remotely right, there'll be a Labour government at some point. Presumably a Labour government anyway at some point, due to the whole democracy thing. But how will that change things, do you think?
Well, look, that will change things very fundamentally from a Welsh government's point of view. So I've lived through both halves. You know, it's a game of two halves in Wales. We had the first half where we had a Labour government in London, and we've had a longer second half, if you can have a longer half, where we've had to deal with a different sort of government. So to return to a position where we have political colleagues in London, where we will be, you know, approaching problems from a basically shared perspective, and where, as I hope, there is a ready-made prospectus for that incoming government to put right some of the constitutional flaws that have been so badly exposed in the last 5 years, that will change things in a fundamental way. Will we agree on everything? Of course we won't. Will there be tensions? Of course there will. You know, at the end of that very first term of Labour government in Wales, Rodri delivered what is probably the most remembered lecture of any First Minister when he gave his Clear Red Water speech. And, you know, it was designed to show that Labour in Wales was different to Labour in London, and that's been very much part of our political success as well. So it will be fundamentally different and fundamentally better, but it will still have, and I think creatively and importantly, some grit in the oyster.
Very good. And then what about with other devolved administrations? What's your experience of those relations over your time? And maybe if that's changed over time at all?
Well, I think we've worked very closely with the Scottish government. I'm been very glad to do that. We've agreed generally on more things than we've disagreed. We disagree, of course, on a very fundamental thing, and that does have a shaping influence on the conversation. But on many of the things that we've talked about today, that basic social democratic tradition that I think animates politics in Wales has animated politics in Scotland as well. Our relations with Northern Ireland have also been, I think, very warm and very positive, and we've hugely missed having Northern Ireland around the table in so many of those intra-government discussions. And it's not just a loss to Northern Ireland when they are not there, it's a loss to Wales when they're not there as well, because, in the very asymmetric nature of the United Kingdom, when you have one very big and very powerful component, sometimes the ability to work with others on things that may look different to us than they do from an English perspective has been very important, and not having our Northern Ireland colleagues in the room has been to their detriment, I'm quite sure of that, but to ours as well, and it is great to see them back as an executive.
It definitely is. Now, so again, maybe Labour politicians do talk about them as social democrats proactively, but I don't hear it often, whereas you do. And you talk about the 25 years as being a country run on social democrat lines broadly. You talked about the social wage. You definitely don't hear as much talk about that in London at the moment. So here's one of the puzzles for people looking at it, which is the experience. Again, I'm looking at the whole period, not just your time as First Minister, which is social democrats in charge in different ways across that whole period, but not the scale of tax rises that people would normally associate, or you may say unfairly, but maybe associate with the social democrat model. Why didn't we see that, do you think, over the 25 years?
Well, Wales has very modest fiscal responsibilities. We have only really three taxes: landfill disposal tax, stamp duty, land tax, as it would be called here, and income tax. And truthfully, the income tax varying powers we have are unusable. I believe that from the very beginning. I gave evidence to the Silk Commission, which lay behind them, arguing with them that if that's what they concluded, they were giving Wales a set of powers that would never be used.
And remind everyone why it's unusable?
Because the ability to vary is very, very narrowly constrained. We don't have the bands capacity that they do in Scotland, which has been part of their ability to make a difference. We can move it up or down a little bit compared to England, and we have peered over that precipice fairly regularly, and every time you conclude it's just not doable. So it's there as an entirely theoretical power, it seems to me. There were other taxes that could have been devolved where we would have made greater use of them, I believe, but the Silk Commission chose income tax variation. I'm afraid the history has, I think, borne out the fact that it's there in theory and it's unusable, unworkable in practice.
Which I think some people would say the early years of Scottish devolution also made that case for that being the position. Council tax was the only thing I was going to raise. Which we didn't get to discuss in the first session, but if people were the keen fiscal reformers in the room, which there are some, it's not their fault, they can get help for that. They would say at least Wales has managed some progress on council tax, some, not as much as maybe some people hoped, but some. Where are you on the glass half full versus glass half empty? We didn't deal with it.
We are the only part of the United Kingdom that has had council tax revaluation during the devolution period, and we have been working very closely with the IFS in more recent times to try to make the council tax fairer. This is my view, and the Welsh Government's view. There is a limit to how fair you can make an inherently unfair tax. Now, we wanted to do that, and we've done it in a series of ways. You can't be imprisoned in Wales anymore for not paying the council tax, and you could be until just a few years ago. You don't pay council tax if you're a care leaver in Wales. We've done far more, I think, than most other places to make sure that category of help you can get for what's not in today's terms called severe mental impairment. We have already made a series of erosions into the unfair nature of the tax. We want to do more. It is not easy because any change that creates losers as well as winners tends to hear a lot from the emailing classes and not so much from
emailing classes. I've never heard that. Have they stopped chattering? They just email.
They're emailing. Yes.
Okay, fine.
I think that is a.
Thank you for the update on political culture.
And alongside that, we have been doing some very serious work on land value taxation, and have continued to do that work during this Senedd term. And I hear what everybody always says, that land value taxation is one of those things that always looks good on paper and nobody's ever managed to do it successfully in practice. But I still think myself that my fondness for devolution is not as a set of league tables between parts of the United Kingdom, but as a ability to have policy experimentation, the living laboratory view of devolution. And I think Wales is well placed to try to be a bit of a living laboratory for how a land value approach to taxation might work.
Let's just wrap up on one area, which is public services, or slightly more generally. So if you went back to the early 2000s and people said, what were the things that you'd want to achieve in Wales? So lots of them would be the similar things on, health service and education. There probably was a view then that more radical change to local government than has happened would have been high up the list, but maybe on my memory of the mid-2000s is flawed. So on which of these areas do you think progress has been made against what people would have expected or hoped, even Labour administrators would have hoped, versus have just proved too difficult in a devolved setting?
Well, I think local government reorganisation, as it was conceptualised then, did require more political capital than there was there to be expended. But what we have done, and it's much less visible, but it's, I think, in the end, will be much more effective, is that we have moved far more local authority services into regional models with shared governance amongst the local authorities that cover those than you would ever have seen back then. So, you know,
just remind everyone, this means rather than merging the entire local authorities,
you create a, this is not the term used in the app, but a single board in which social services for, let's say, 5 local authorities are planned and delivered on a common footprint, rather than every one of them having their own social services department with its own director and its own. So that approach to local government reform, I think, has been doable, and I think in many ways will achieve more than a sort of forced merger would have done. Well, just two very last points. And just, you know, the thing that is most difficult for Welsh public services is the thing that is most difficult for public services everywhere. It is 14 years of underinvestment. You know, in Wales, as everywhere else, satisfaction levels in our health service reached their height in 2010, you know, higher than any time in the history of the NHS. And that's because we'd had a decade of sustained incremental investment where we were able to put things in place and do the things we wanted to do. 14 years of the opposite means that our public services today, all of them, are characterised by enormous pressures and, you know, not having the resource that's needed to meet those. So that is an ongoing struggle.
Yep.
On the other side of the coin, for me, I think in Wales all the way through we have had a stronger sense of how, when it comes to essential public services, ownership matters. And, you know, I hope that that will be a lesson for the coming period, that when you are talking about fundamental things that you cannot do without, the idea that you organise those on a market basis where you allow profits to be taken out of those fundamental services, that is not the way to organise them. Now, we have a Welsh water company which is a not-for-profit distribution company, and while it has some performance challenges, it certainly doesn't have any of the challenges that you would see in Thames.
It was quite hard. It'd be quite hard to load up on billions of debt as a.
Well, it doesn't have all of that, but in other places too. One of the things that I'm looking forward to a lot in the coming weeks is that we will put a bill in front of the Senedd to abolish the extraction of private profit from services for looked after children in Wales. And if you look at the Monopoly and Mergers Commission, 2 reports in recent times showing how extractive profit has been in the care of the most vulnerable children in our society, where the state is that child's parent. You think of some, you know, moments that remain with you always. I met a young woman, 14 years old, brought to me in a delegation of children by the then Children's Commissioner, who told me how she had seen herself up on a website where her local authority had invited companies to put in the lowest bid to look after her. Now just think about that for a moment. You are a 14-year-old child. Your family circumstances have been so difficult that the state has stepped in to take over your care, and you decide to discharge that responsibility by putting that child up for auction. That will not happen again in Wales.
That's a powerful case. Right, let's wrap up on 2 questions, only the first one of which is a serious one. So you started and ended a bit on whether you want to call it unstable settlement or suppressed crisis, the 2 phrases. In 10 years' time, where are we going to be? Are we going to resolve we're going to unsuppress it, hopefully by not having the crisis, but by removing it, or where are we going to be in 10 years?
Well, I can tell you I'd like to be.
Right.
I can't promise you that we would be there. We would have done some very basic things like, you know, abolished the House of Lords and replaced it with a Parliament of the Nations and the regions with particular responsibility for constitutional matters and protecting the Constitution, we would have heard no more about parliamentary sovereignty, a great myth of our times, but one which allows Westminster politicians to treat devolution as though it were a toy on the end of a piece of string, where you edge a bit more out and you pull it back when you don't like what they do with it. We would have recognised the fact that already in the United Kingdom, sovereignty is dispersed to the four nations, and what we would have would be a radically federalist model in which we disperse power and then agree to pool it back together again for those common purposes that we would agree we would do better together. And, you know, for me, as someone who believes in the United Kingdom, that's quite a list of things. You know, I don't want a Welsh Navy or a Welsh Air Force. I don't want Welsh embassies around the world. So foreign affairs, defence, macroeconomic policy, social security policy. For me, I would choose to pool much of our sovereignty back. But that would be the model. Not everything is held in Westminster, you know, and to varying degrees it gets dispersed. Everything is dispersed to begin with.
And then the crisis would have been...
And then we pool it back.
Yep.
And I think that would give you a stable model for a United Kingdom that people would want to belong to. And that's the thing that I think has been missing so much of the debate. Who is making the case for the United Kingdom? Not a fearful case, not a case that says, oh, it'll be dreadful if you leave. Or, you know, we're not going to give you a pathway to leaving. There's no long-term future in that. You have to make a case for the United Kingdom, the positive case that the people in every part of the United Kingdom would say, well, that's a place I'd like to belong to.
Very good. Well, I feel like bad ruining that with the frivolous question now, but I'm not saying this was the main thing I was thinking while you were talking, but I was wondering, what was the Egyptian potato order?
Wow.
Which is making me feel really shallow because you've just given that rallying cry for a better future. But I do want to know what the Egyptian potato order was.
Well, you didn't quite recollect the whole, because it was the smaller Egyptian potato.
Are there larger ones?
Yes.
Okay.
It wasn't any Egyptian
okay,
potato.
sorry.
It was a set of rules about what regulations applied to a potato coming from Egypt, depending upon the size of it.
Okay. Right, okay. I feel chastened by in every sense. Right, can we all thank Mark for his brilliant thoughts today? I also want to thank all of you for coming this morning. I hope it's been interesting, and to thank all of our speakers, in particular Claudia Rice. And I also want to thank the team at the Resolution Foundation and at PolicyWise for making today happen. There aren't enough of these kind of sessions, so it's great that we've managed to make this happen. And all of you should go out, and the whole point of today is that you keep learning. But first of all, you can keep learning by eating some lunch and chatting about it upstairs. So have a good lunch, everyone. Thank you for coming.